Welcome to Heritage Hour, where history comes alive through calm yet dramatic storytelling. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Share your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and join the conversation so you never miss a story. Tonight's theme is one America has often chosen to bury. 5 stories America tried to forget. These are tales of tragedy, mystery, and resilience, moments left in the shadows, now brought back into the light. So settle in, relax, and let's journey together into the forgotten chapters of the past. They always told me wind was the harmless thing, that it only played with the canvas, that it could not break you the way rock did or choke you the way dust did. But the first sound of that April morning wasn't harmless. It was the guy ropes singing like fiddle strings drawn too tight, the whole tent humming against my ear as I held the coffee pot over the tiny stove. When the breeze lifted, the flame leaned, the pot trembled, and I had the strange thought that the camp itself was holding its breath. Then the wind let go, and somewhere uphill there was a cough, the bolt of a gun chambering around, and I said Patrick's name without meaning to. "It's only the boys on the ridge," he said. He was lacing his boots, shoulders bent, the canvas light turning the freckles on his forearms into a spill of rust. "They keep themselves busy is all." "They keep us busy," I said, setting the pot down hard enough it splashed. Hot coffee on a tent floor makes a map no one wants to read. It pools and tracks out footprints like rivers you'd rather not follow. Patrick gave me that sideways, good-humored look that had the habit of finding me even on the worst days. "You're the one taught me not to jump at what I can't fix, May. Remember?" "I remember," I said. "And I remember our son sleeps light." From the other cot, Jamie made a small sound and rolled over, blanket bunched under his chin, dark hair stuck every which way. Outside, a child laughed with that chest-deep certainty only children have. A moment later, the laugh thinned into a squeal as someone gave chase. The camp was like that. A string of ordinary sounds you learned to listen through. Water glugging from barrels, spoons clinking against tin, clotheslines creaking, somebody tuning a fiddle, the light clack of knitting needles, coughs, murmurs, cries of, "Johnny, don't you go near the tracks," and "Maria, tell your brother he'll bust his ankle on those rocks." And now and then a sudden faraway crack like the sky stepping wrong. "Greek Easter," Patrick said, as if saying the words would anchor the day. "They'll roast a lamb. Nikos promised to bring Jamie a bit of the sweet bread." "You promised Mrs. Vargas I'd mind her little one while she waits on a letter," I said. "And you promised me you wouldn't go hot with anybody just because he wears a button you don't like." He tied the knot in his laces, leaned to kiss my knuckles. His hands were clean because there was no coal to pick today. Another day of standing on principle. Another day of light pockets and small meals. And still I could smell the seam on him, that bittersweet, iron dark scent that settles in a man's skin the way fear settles in a woman's stomach. "I'll keep a cool head," he said. My word on it. Patrick always kept his word. It was the world that didn't. We'd come to Ludlow the previous autumn, after the mine manager in Walsenburg told Patrick he didn't like the way he nodded at the Union man's leaflets. And after that, someone wrote our name in chalk on our door. And after that, someone else knocked over the cradle while I was in the yard with the wash. That was how people made their intentions known. Not with a conversation, but with a carton of milk tipped and left to sour in the sun. We packed the wagon and followed the string of others down the road, out under those white-struck peaks, to the tent colony by the tracks, where the company couldn't own the ground beneath our beds. The first night, the wind taught me how canvas breathes. The second night, I learned what it sounds like when 100 people try to sleep on the same patch of earth, the way the coughs and dreams line up, the way the railroad settles itself with sighs. By the third night, the fiddle came. Someone set a pot to boil beans. Someone else showed me how to make a cellar pit under the cot so you could store your flour and your keepsakes and, if it came to it, your body. "If it comes to it," I'd repeated, thinking I understood and not wanting to say it out loud. The woman teaching me, a sturdy Italian named Francesca, whose hair escaped her scarf like ivy, gave me the kind of look that makes you feel seen and blessed and scolded all at once. "You dig, May," she said softly, "and you keep digging until your arms ache, and you tamp the floor, and you put a plank over and a rug on top. It's just a little hole. That's all, a little hole." She had 3 children then. Now she had 2. On the morning of April 20th, Jamie woke before the second whistle snapped from the tracks. He sat up and rubbed his eyes with fists that were still more wrist than hand and said, "Is it the lamb day? Nico said we could dance." "It's the lamb day," I said, and felt a bright little kite of happiness tug against its string inside me, fragile but flying. "If we make it so." Patrick shook out his shirt and buttoned it. The shirt had a tear near the hem where it had snagged on the corner of the wagon bed the day we first came. The frayed place worried me, not because it left him bare, but because of the story it told, that nothing here mended itself. "I'll go down to the tracks," he said. "They want men for the watch. It's mostly for show." "Mostly," I echoed. He grinned at our boy and lifted him up as if he weighed no more than a loaf. "Guard your mother from the sugar bowl," he said. "And if Nikos brings the bread, you bring me the first slice, or I turn Greek on you and shout to the moon." Jamie giggled and wrapped his arms round Patrick's neck. The kind of fierce, etching-fast hug that always found me later and left me hollowed out with missing. When Patrick had gone, I stepped outside and tilted my face to the light. The familiar things were all there. The wash line between 2 poles, the little stove with its scarred pipe, the shovel leaning where I'd left it, the rows of tents like sails, that same tender feeling you get at dawn when the day hasn't put its hands on you yet. Smoke rose straight up from a few cook fires. Children tugged at their boots. You could smell mutton, faint but promising. You could smell coal dust, stronger because it had nowhere to go. Across the way, Francesca's youngest, Rosa, toddled with a doll whose hair was only yarn and whose dress had been cut down from a woman's skirt. She'd scrape the doll's button eyes on the ground and then blow the dirt away and kiss it. The tenderness of it, foolish and brave. "May," someone called, and I looked up to see him, Private Whitcomb. Elias when he dared it, Whitcomb when he wore the stiffness of his uniform like a second skin. He stood just beyond the edge of our tent's shade, cap tilted, chin shaved clean. He was what 20 looks like before it believes in itself. Corn blonde hair under that cap, and ink blue eyes he tried not to move too much. A boy who was a man because someone had given him a rifle and a meal ticket. "You best not come in," I told him. "No matter how friendly you mean to be, it puts you in a light that scorches." "I'm not here to bother," he said, voice low enough only the canvas and I could hear it. "Captain's got us up the ridge, just wanted to say keep your boy close today. There's talk. Talk is a sport around here," I said, "and you play it as well as the rest." He swallowed. "It isn't play. They brought more cartridges. And that armored car again, the one with the plate sides. The boys call it something I don't like. The Death Special," I supplied. He flinched because I had said it neat, because the language knew itself. He looked past me at the wash line. A shirt flapped and the shadow on his face changed. "I grew up in Iowa," he said, like a confession, like a line in a prayer he'd forgotten how to end. "My sister's got boys the size of yours. I came west for the pay, not to..." He lifted a hand, let it fall. "I just mean it don't sit right when a day ought to be for feast and somebody says to bring extra powder." "Thank you for the warning," I said. "Because gratitude is a way of saving a little bit of your own soul. We'll keep ourselves small." He glanced uphill where the ridge cut the sky like a bad seam. "If trouble starts, go to ground," he murmured, and then he straightened into his soldier. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his cap and went. An hour passed the way hours pass when you are busy with small, brave things. I swept the dirt as if I could make it new. I scrubbed a spot off our one good plate. Mrs. Vargas came with her baby, and I told her she was beautiful for knowing how to tie her scarf so that it kept the wind out, but didn't pinch her ears. She laughed and said if she were as beautiful. As I said, her husband wouldn't need to take the long job in Raton. Nikos came with the bread and a flask that smelled like sharp plum sugar, and he kissed Jamie on the head and tried to kiss me on the cheek, and I pushed him away, and he laughed again and said the saints would forgive a Greek on Easter. Even a Greek with a flirt for a mouth. "Go easy," I told him. And he crossed his heart in mock penance and said he would. And then shouted with all the bigness he had, "Dance! We dance. God brings us the day. Try and stop it!" He beat a pan with a spoon. Men on the ridge looked down and did not smile. The first shots were not ours. Anyone who tells you different wants a story he can hold without burning his hand. A crack from the hills, then another, then the longer rip of a thing that doesn't just speak once but stutters like anger. The sound slashed across the afternoon and turned everything inside out. The lamb smoke, the bread steam, the conversation of tin spoons and fiddles until we were a photograph someone had torn sideways. "Jamie," I said, and I was already moving, already mashing down the canvas flap that served as our door, already reaching for the plank that covered the pit beneath our cot. The plank was smooth from being lifted and set down 50 times, smooth like the back of a hand memorized by love. I slid it, grabbed the quilt we kept at the foot of the bed and said, "In." He stared at me as if I had said something foolish. "In the hole? Mama, it's where the flower goes. Today it's where you go," I said, and I lifted him with that not now later gentleness a mother saves for the moments when she needs compliance more than sense. He let me place him inside. The dirt smelled like pennies and rain, though there had been no rain for weeks. "Pull this over your mouth," I told him, and put the edge of the quilt between his hands. "Breathe slow, darling, like you do when you're trying to hear the train before you see it." "What about you?" he said. "I'll be right after you," I lied, and hoped the Lord listened to tone and not content. Outside, someone shouted in Greek. A woman screamed a scream she would never entirely stop screaming, not for the rest of her days. The canvas jolted. A hole tore in the tent wall the size of my fist, light cutting through my kitchen like a blade. Dust jumped off the table and hung in the air as if it had lost its story and could not think what to do next. "Patrick," I said to the world, and thought of him down at the tracks with the watch. His shirt with the frayed hem, his handsome, worn-out face turned toward the sound. Another crack tore through and something pinged off the stove. The stove spit sparks like it resented being hit. A thread of smoke curled from the stovepipe where the bullet had nicked it, just a little, like pinching a nerve. "May!" Francesca cried from the neighboring tent, her voice thinned out by fear and canvas. Come, Rosa, get down, I slid into the pit and pulled the plank. The darkness wasn't total. The bullet hole offered a coin of daylight, but the space was tight. My shoulder pressed against the dirt wall. The earth was cool and reticent, as if what it knew it was not sure it should tell. I pulled the quilt over our heads and put my hand on Jamie's chest. It rose and fell fast. Slower, I whispered, and we made our breaths match. When a human being can't make your heart obey, sometimes a pattern can. Above us, canvas snapped. The tent was a drum someone was beating. The metal up the hill spoke in its stutter. The sound pushed down into our hiding and shook chalk dust off the underside of the plank, so it made a tiny weather over our faces. God forgive me, I counted. 30 shots, 40 more. Between volleys there would be the tenderest, strangest noises. The clink of our spoon where it had fallen. The whisper of the quilt when Jamie adjusted it. The smallest sigh my body made as it let go of something I could no longer hold. When fear runs long, it becomes a companion of its own. Sitting with you, hand on your leg, each of you pretending not to notice the other. Time is not time in a place like that. It's a string that gets pulled, then tied, then frayed. After a while, a smell came that wasn't the dirt or the stove or the metal. It was sweet and violent, almost like the lacquer on a new violin. Kerosene. I didn't move. I didn't move because you can't when everything is making its argument for why you should get small. But the smell thickened and a new sound came. A crackle like a dress caught on bramble, and heat bent the air under the plank. Just a touch, a suggestion. Jamie's fingers tightened on my wrist. Mama, keep breathing slow, I said, and it took a will I didn't know I owned to slide my other hand toward the edge of the plank and pry at it. Not enough to open, not enough to let in the world, but enough to make room for another wafer of air. Above us the tent whispered one last time and then it roared. The air changed, gone the way water goes when someone pulls the plug. There was sucking, and the dirt over my head vibrated like a struck matchbox. The quilt grew hot against my mouth. The little coin of daylight from the bullet hole went wide and mad with bright, then turned colorless and smoked, then was gone altogether, the hole itself a black that smelled like old oil and grief. The camp was on fire. There are 50 ways to die that don't involve blood. There are 100 ways to live in spite of every one of them. I set the quilt over Jamie's face, made a cave for his mouth, and said into his ear so only his bones could hear me, "You breathe because I tell you to, and you count with me." And you remember how it sounded when Nikos laughed, and you remember the way Papa makes his hands into an antler when he plays elk, and you remember the taste of that bread, even though we only got a bite. He squeezed his eyes shut, and I felt him pull air like a man pulls up a rope hand over hand. I counted 1, 2, 3, a long time later, 4. The plank shifted. For an instant, my heart had the hope a person has when she thinks it is a friend. Then the underside of the plank buckled down, as if something heavy had fallen on it, and a stranger's weight pressed against our hiding. The air thinned. The heat thickened until it was the kind of thing you could see with your eyes closed. May, I told myself, but made the second word of my life sentence, the one I used when I needed to obey in a way that silenced the animal. Now, I braced my shoulder under the plank and heaved up. It gave no more than a finger's breadth. I heaved again. The wood was hot enough to smart. I thought of Elias Whitcomb's face under that cap. I thought of Patrick's last grin. I thought of the lamb smoke that had hung so beautifully in the air. The third push, the plank lifted half an inch. I slid my hand up and bled knuckles against the splinter line, then shoved again with both legs. Something shifted above. The weight rolled enough that I could wedge the quilt between plank and floor and keep the slot open. Smoke curled down. It tasted like pennies and old hair. I pressed my mouth to the wedge of air and drank it down and pushed the rest at my boy, my hand all the while on his chest. Making the rhythm, making the rhythm, making the rhythm. I could hear voices now through the roar, thin and far and simple. A woman calling for a child in a language I didn't know but knew entirely. A man praying, not to ask anything from God, not to bargain, just to say around the edges of the smoke, "Here I am. Here I am. Here I am." After a while, that could have been a minute or the length of a hymn. The pressure changed. My ears popped. Cool came. Then a shout so close it cracked against our little roof. "This one!" The plank lifted and light poured in, not sweet but wild. Hands, air, the outline of a face between flames, eyes set on something it wasn't sure it had the right to see. "May," a voice said. Wind burned and too young to be giving orders to anything, even the syllables coming out of it. "For God's sake, come." I shoved Jamie upward and Elias pulled him as if he were hauling water out of a well. He reached again and caught my underarm, and I came up among the burning canvas and the skewed bed frame and the stove that had fallen as if it were drunk. He had stripped off his uniform coat and thrown it on top of the flames to make a moment's corridor, and his shirt sleeves were rolled and the hair on his forearms curled in the heat. For an instant, his face looked like a child's who has found a dog and intends to keep it, even if his mother says it's a stray. Then the heat hit both of us, and the dog learned it had to run. We ran. We ran bent over, Jamie at my waist, Elias flanking us with his body a shield without words. Between tents there were little lanes, paths made 1,000 times over by other feet, and now they were chimneys. Somewhere a barrel popped its band and iron sang. I saw Francesca through a seam in the smoke, her mouth open far wider than any sound came from it, one hand on a tent pole as if to stop the sky from falling. I think I saw Rosa at her feet, or maybe that was another child, a doll without its yarn hair. The world was a handful of moments and the single rule that got you through: keep moving. We burst out at the edge of the colony into an air that was not clean and might never be again, but at least it wasn't trying to climb inside your lungs with claws. The hill above us barked and threw chips of stone. Elias shouldered us behind a cut in the ground, a little arroyo where storm water runs when there is such a thing as rain. "Stay," he said, and his mouth formed more words he couldn't afford to say. Then he turned and went back into that light. Later, after wind, after shouting, after the sun stepped down, after the metal counted out a last few stuttering sentences and fell quiet. After that, there was night. The night had edges that could hurt you. The fire sent up sparks like its own constellation, and you could have read your Bible by it if you had the hands to hold the book. Jamie burrowed under my shawl and went to sleep with that fierce determination children have to take rest when their bodies demand it. I sat with my back to the cut bank and watched the camp make its terrible music. The groans, the low keening, the sudden splashes when someone poured water on a thing that shouldn't have been burned. I waited for Patrick as if by staring a hole in the dark I might see him coming through it. I waited until the waiting made a new person out of me, and I didn't much like her, but I knew she would survive. He came near dawn, not walking so much as placing himself from one place to another, as if his strings had been tangled up, and he had to think about each step. He had a tear in his shirt near the hem, and it made me want to laugh and weep, because at some hour I had been the kind of woman who worried about that. His hands were black with the soot that comes from burning canvas. His face was a story I couldn't even pretend to know. I got to my feet and we ran at each other and then stopped an arm's length apart because if we touched, the truth might shake loose and we both knew we needed to parcel it out slow. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Not where it shows," he said. His voice had stones in it. He put his hand on Jamie's head and held it there long enough the boy stirred and blinked up and said, "Papa?" in a tone that tried to be casual and failed. Patrick swallowed and said, "There's a thing I don't know if I should tell you." "You don't have to tell me yet," I said, "because sometimes protection is the shape you make with your body around the things you love. Sit, breathe." He sat and looked up at the ridge where the guards had been. The hill was a dark thought against the bruised sky. You could see the camp below, or what was left of it. Poles like bones, squares of ash where beds had been, the iron rings of stoves, the occasional box that had not burned but blackened and burst. The smoke wrote its story on the morning light and didn't stop. "Louis," Patrick said finally. "They took him." He tried to talk peace at the rail and they dragged him up toward the tracks and he closed his mouth and the words stayed behind his teeth like a thing that should not see daylight. He stared at his hands. "He's gone. I knew that name." We all did. Louis with the quick grin, who could get a crowd to listen or to sing, who'd broken fights with a joke, who had danced on a plank to make it bend because he wanted the children to laugh. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words were too small for what they tried to cover. "It's not the only thing," he said. And I watched him struggle with the telling because some things you name and they shrink, and some things you name and they swell. They dug under the tents. Some of the women had the sense to put a pit for food, and then for themselves. The men weren't let in because you know how we are. We make the air go fast. But the women and the babies... "Patrick," I said, one hand out, fingers not touching him but finding the shape of him in the air. "You don't have to." "They didn't burn," he whispered. "Mostly the air, May. It's the air that hurts you first. That's the part nobody thinks of when he says he's only lighting the edges to scare folks out. It's the air." I closed my eyes. The quilt had a scorch mark where my mouth had been. I could taste kerosene on my tongue. I wanted to spit, but it was in me in a way that wouldn't come out. "We're alive," I said, and then said it again because I needed to set it on the ground between us like a bucket and ask it to hold some of the heat. Jamie climbed into his father's lap and stuck his face in Patrick's chest like it was the only place left in the world that could teach him anything. Patrick held him, and the look in his eyes was something that would change the direction of a river if it had the say. At sunup, the men and women went back toward what had been home. We went with them because there wasn't anywhere else we could go, and because you have to see with your own eyes what you will be expected to remember. The poles and ash were all still there, and the smoke and the debris that looked like debris until you let your heart align itself with what it knew, and then it became evidence. The east wind worried at the ashes and made grey ghosts walk for a while and then fall. A kettle lay on its side with its lid a little way off, as if it had stepped away for a moment and would be back. A fiddle's neck lay blacked and warped like a question mark. There was a crowd at one spot near the middle where two tents had stood with their guy ropes almost kissing. People's backs made a wall. The way they leaned in told you what you didn't want to know. Patrick took my hand and I squeezed hard because the squeeze was for me as much as for him. We made our way to the edge of that human wall and stopped. I do not give you a picture. I do not describe. I only say that under the plank, under the rug, under the little world those women had made to hold their breath and their patience and their planning, Someone had taken a shovel and lifted the earth, and what the earth gave back was heavier than anyone there could carry. I looked at Elias Whitcomb. He stood at the far edge in his shirt sleeves, cap pushed back and eyes on the ground. There was no rifle on him. He had soot on his cheek in the shape of a handprint, as if someone had reached for him in running and said, "Help me, soldier." His mouth was a thin November line. When he lifted his eyes, he found me. We didn't nod because no gesture we had enough gravity. But he knew I had seen him before dawn become the sort of man a boy would be proud to be. And I knew he had used the day God gave him to contradict the uniform that had made him a stranger to himself. Someone started praying. A woman tried to hum a hymn and her voice snagged in the middle and tore. The men made a plan, as men will, because action is the one liturgy they can always remember. They said words like railroad and telegram and inquest and Denver and Rockefeller, and in that last name, there was a shape of an anger too big to fit in a mouth. Somebody said, "There will be answers." And somebody else said the harder, truer thing, "There will be answers we do not like." By afternoon, word had flown as fast as a raven. Men came from other colonies and from down valley ranches, and if any of them had left home with a notion of mourning carefully, they set it aside the instant they saw. The faces of the men who didn't belong to us turned the color of iron in a rainstorm. The strike was embers that had waited for a wind. Now the wind had found it. In the days that followed, there were raids and shots and a breathless kind of justice that knows it cannot make anything whole, but is compelled to try to even a scale that nature itself has bolted crooked. They call it the 10-day war by the folks who give wars names, as if the number were the measure that mattered. That night, when light took itself down to a fewer, kinder watts, we moved upwind. There were ranchers who had heard the news, who had wives that would not sleep if they did not put a soup pot on the back of the stove for us. We pitched a borrowed canvas in a drawer and listened to the quiet that comes after your quiet has been stolen and returned with new dents. Jamie lay between us and refused for the first time in his little life to give up his stubbornness at bedtime. "Tell me," he said, "about the bread." "We'll have bread again," I said. "The sweet one," he said, "with the sugar on top." "Pascha," Patrick said, tasting the foreign word as if it might heal him. "It's a Greek Easter bread. Nikos says his mother puts an egg on top to show the empty tomb." Jamie thought about that in the big way a child's thinking is big. "Is it empty?" "Not today," Patrick said, "but it will be." He put his hand across our boy's back, the sort of quiet shelter you give a thing that is sleeping, though he was not asleep yet. After he drifted off, Patrick said, "If you could go back, would you choose different? Would you keep your head down at the old camp? Let the bosses weigh our coal with the scale they like? Let them charge at the company store until we die still owing? Would you keep quiet and safe?" I pulled the blanket to my chin because there was a bite in the air that said, "Spring remembers winter out here longer than it should." "We were never safe," I said. "We only get to choose the story we stand in." He made a sound that wanted to be a laugh but couldn't find the room. "The story, May. People will say it's about men and mines and who owns the earth," I said. "And it is. But that's the big story. The little one, the one I can carry, is about a wash line and a quilt and a boy who counted breaths and the Italian woman teaching another woman how to dig a proper hole. It's about a soldier with Iowa on his tongue, using his body like a plank to make a path through fire. It's about Nikos trying to kiss me when his pockets were empty and thinking the world would forgive him because there was music." He was quiet and then said, "We should go to Trinidad when this lifts. They say the union run a kitchen there. We can stand in line without shame." "We can stand," I said. That's all we ever asked. In the weeks after, reporters came with hats and notebooks and the neat way of holding pens that tells you they never held a pick. I poured them coffee and they let it go cold while they wrote. They wrote down words like massacre and pit. They wrote women and children as if those were words they had only just learned and were trying on for shape. I told them the parts I could tell and let my voice go flat when I reached the edges of the parts I could not. When one of them asked me if I believed this would change anything, I said something I am sorry for, but also not. That depends on whether your paper prints what you saw or what it is paid to say. The thing about a story is there's always somebody standing at an edge trying to turn it toward a use. Some men used Ludlow as a cudgel against a rival. Some used it to raise money. Some used it to say, well, there are two sides, as if the air in a burning tent cares about your equivalents. The union made posters. The company made distances. People in cities far away said, what a pity, and then, what a scandal, and then, what a bore, each word pulling respect for it a little thinner. But something stuck. You could hear a new song at meetings, we shall not be moved, that sounded less like a threat and more like a promise the mouth makes to the spine. Men who had never before believed that their day's sweat belonged to them and not to the man with the ledger started to carry their heads like the next inch in height was theirs to claim. Patrick went to work again in another seam where the company name on the pay envelope was different, but the dust wasn't. He came home with the same cough that serves as the chorus for working men. He came home with new dirt in the creases of his smile and old love behind it. We got another tent. It smelled like wax and hope at first, then like stew and feet and coal like all the others. I couldn't set a pot to boil without watching the flame as if it might put on a soldier's coat and stand up and shout. I learned how to watch less. I didn't learn how to stop. Elias came by once in December after his term ended. He wore a coat that fit him poorly because nobody wears the right coat for leaving a role that big. He said he was headed east again. I gave him bread I knew how to make, and he held it with both hands like a sacrament. I'm sorry, he said. You did what you could, I told him. That's not an apology. That's a balance sheet. He nodded. He looked either wider or narrower. I couldn't decide which. He kept looking past me at the tent as if trying to see through it to a fire that was not there. I've been thinking, he said suddenly, how wind has a sound. I didn't know it before. It has a note. If it hits canvas just so, it sings, I said. It sings, he echoed. We sat in that borrowed winter sun and spoke of small things. He told me how Iowa smells in spring, a wetness that makes the whole world look like it's just waking and stretching its arms. I told him how Jamie had learned to spell his name and now was putting it on everything with a stub pencil until the house looked signed by an artist who knew only one word. We didn't say that there were nights when both of us woke to a corridor of heat and a roar that is not fire and not water and not metal, but some sum you'll never finish adding. He stood to go, and I wanted to tell him the thing I tell every boy who leaves my line of sight. Be decent. But I knew he had already built that prayer into his bones. Years pass. They do not erase. They accumulate. Men will walk into a mine tomorrow and take a lamp down into a dark that has its own weather and its own ways. Some of them will come back with their pockets as thin as ever and a story they can't quite make new because it is every day. Some of them won't. Some of them will be paid a fairer wage than the one their fathers took, or will find there is a man with a union card instead of a foreman's glare at the gate. We will tell ourselves laws came of those days, and we will be right. We will tell ourselves children make it past 5 more often, and we will be right. We will tell ourselves that bosses learned shame. And then we will look around and see what we always see. Some learned it, some didn't, and most learned how to hide it better. Once, years after I went back by Ludlow, we were headed to see a cousin up near Pueblo, and the young man, wanted to see the place where he had learned counting as prayer. We stopped and stood, and the wind came down that draw with the same old habit. The bones of the colony weren't there anymore, not unless you counted the bit of rusty wire half hidden in sage and the way the ground lay like a tired back. Somebody had put up a stone with names on it. I read them, and each one made a little hollow that filled with water behind my eyes until the names ran together like they might at last have found a place where they could share the same line without trouble. A prairie dog popped up and scolded us for standing where he thought we shouldn't. Jamie laughed and put his hands in his pockets and said, "It looks ordinary." "It is," I said. "That's the miracle and the sin." He bent to touch the dirt. "I don't remember the fire," he said. "I remember your voice counting. I remember a taste like nails. I remember Papa's breath making my hair move when he leaned over me that night. That's the piece I kept. That's a good piece," I said. He straightened and looked at me with a face that had learned new truths I hadn't given him and liked me anyway. "You think people will keep the whole of it? Not the posters, the real shape." "I think they will keep what fits their pockets," I said. "And every once in a while somebody will reach deeper." We turned to go. The wind pulled at the guy ropes of a memory only I could see and made that old, taut music. I didn't mind it. Not that day. Because when you've survived a note that nearly unraveled you and found a harmony on the other side, every sound after is both an ache and an answer. The road ran out ahead. The boy walked with his hands in his coat like a man who had a place to be, and he did. I took a last look at that ordinary dirt that had held so much of our noise and our silence, and I said, not out loud but with every part of me that had learned how to speak without words, "I remember." And the wind, polite as ever, pretended not to hear and went on singing its quiet, stubborn song. The first sound that morning was rope rubbing against wood, a dry, tired sigh as a soldier tightened a wagon's load. The rope fibers whispered, and then a cough lifted from the long line of people on the road. A thin thread of sound that seemed to hang in the cold air and stay. A boy lifted his head from his mother's shawl, eyes rimmed with sleep and dust, and he stared toward a place where the trail dissolved into pale powder. Behind him a mule stamped and swished its tail. Leather creaked. Somewhere a canteen tapped against a belt buckle, soft as a distant bell. "Up," a voice called in English, empty of anger, empty of kindness. "Move!" The boy stood. His bones ached, like someone had poured sand into them and left it to harden. His mother tightened the faded cloth around her shoulders and looked at the circle of ash where their small fire had been. The ash held the memory of warmth the way a pressed hand leaves heat in a blanket. She knelt, pinched a little ash and rubbed it between finger and thumb. There was no medicine in it, only habit and dignity. Still, the motion gave her something that felt like a beginning. "Drink," she said, and passed him a gourd of water that smelled faintly of smoke. He drank and handed it back. She had very little left to carry. 2 blankets, a small pouch made from a scrap of her grandmother's skirt, with 4 kernels of corn wrapped in cloth inside, and a slender bundle of cedar twigs tied with thread. Tucked into the seam at her hip was a thin stone the color of clear sky. She did not touch it unless she needed to remember that color. On the far side of the road, a soldier swung into the saddle and looked down with a face that had not yet learned what it would become. He had a narrow jaw and a dusting of beard that never thickened, and his eyes moved like he measured things without quite meaning to. The army called him Private Amos Grant. He had been a farmer before war, made a map of his choices. He guided his horse a little off the road so his animal would not stir dust into the people's faces. He told himself it was for the horse. He told himself this about many small mercies. "Keep the pace," the sergeant barked. We reached the river by nightfall. The column began to move, a slow unspooling of bodies and blankets and thin shoes. Some carried children. Some children walked and held their sisters' hands, blinking in the wind. The sun rose and hung in the washed-out sky like a coin worn smooth by too many hands. The air smelled of wool, animals, and iron. Dust rose and settled in throats, turned words into coughs. "Do you remember the peach trees?" the boy asked after a while, voice sanded down by air and walking. His mother nodded. She did not say that she could still feel the ladder rungs under her feet or the rough bark giving way in her palm. She did not say that the flames had made a sound like steady breathing while they swallowed the orchard, leaving trunks like bones. She walked. Around them, the land lay thinned by winter and soldiers. Amos rode to the side. He watched the wheels, the hooves, the faces. He knew the interpreter, Michael, a quiet man with a scarf the color of clay. Michael's mother had been born among the people on the road. His father had traded along these routes. The army paid him to turn one language into another, but the work carved lines around his mouth that did not match his age. "Water stop in 2 miles," Amos called to the line. Michael repeated him for those who did not speak English, and the news moved through the column like the ghost of a breeze. They walked. The road climbed and fell, a flexed muscle under them. The sound of feet, so many, so slow, became its own weather. The boy counted steps until numbers frayed into rhythm. When he stumbled, his mother's hand was there before he was done falling, her fingers firm and warm through the shawl. At the creek, where water threaded through stones, he crouched and splashed his face. The cold shocked his skin awake. He cupped water to his mouth, tasted metal from old canteens, and then cupped more. Upstream, a woman whispered into her hands and poured the water onto a child's head. The child's hair clung to the scalp like black grass in rain. "Not too much," a soldier said, not looking closely. The woman nodded, as anyone nods when survival depends on the shape of someone else's mouth. Amos swung down and led his horse to drink. He kept an eye on the back wagon's near wheel, where one spoke had a split. He had a length of wet rawhide ready for when it failed. He had seen what happened when a wagon died on the road. The sick became sicker. The hungry moved a step closer to a kind of silence that did not make room for breath. He glanced up and found the boy watching him with that careful, measuring gaze he had seen in farming towns when locusts came or a calf fell sick. Amos nodded. The boy did not look away. Something warm moved in Amos's chest, like stepping close to a fire after a long, cold stretch. Beyond the creek, the road turned flinty. Sharp stones carved thin, bloody crescent moons across heels. The column bent with the land, a long rope thrown over the shoulders of small hills. By afternoon, the light flattened. Shadows crouched in dry gullies like men resting on their heels. The horizon kept its distance the way horizons do out there, like shy animals that refuse to be noticed too soon. "Rest," the sergeant called when dusk was a thought away, and the line arranged itself into camp without speaking. Choreography learned by repetition and grief. Fires scratched at the air in small, hungry circles. Men with rifles stood at the edges like fence posts. Mules tied to a rope stamped and sighed. Night fell with the smell of smoke and grass. The boy sat with his mother and watched sparks rise like small stars, trying to remember where to go. His feet throbbed with their own pulse. He wanted to hear the story again, the one about twins who faced monsters so children could sleep. He did not need the ending anymore. He liked the part where the twins decided to make the world safer, and then did. His mother took a sliver of cedar from her bundle and fed it to the fire. The scent lifted sweet and resinous. She whispered. He could not hear the words, but he felt them. Beyond their circle, Michael sat with his back to a wagon wheel and rubbed at his eyes like a man who had misplaced the simple trick of sleep. "Are we going to die here?" the boy asked softly, not sure if he meant tonight, on this road, or in the wider room of time. His mother looked at him, her mouth a straight line of patience and steel. "We are going to walk," she said. "We are going to remember. We are going to be ourselves wherever we stand." He let those words settle. He pressed them into the corners where fear tried to live. On the far side of camp, Amos dipped hard biscuit into coffee and watched the dark. Men's voices rose and fell, jokes from mouths that needed to prove they were not afraid of quiet, talk about dances, talk about a field back home, winter wheat hidden under snow. Someone played a mouth harp, the notes small and round. Amos thought of his brother's grave back east with a borrowed stone. He thought of the woman in a blue bonnet who had refused him because she wanted to marry a man the world was not already trying to break. "Grant," the sergeant said, coming over with a tin cup. "You keep letting them cling to those wagons, and you will end up carrying the wagons yourself." "I keep them moving," Amos answered. "Your job is to keep the wagon moving," the sergeant said. He sighed, as if lending advice to a neighbor over a fence. "You have a tender heart. Fine. Put it in your pocket and button it. There is no room for it on the road." Amos looked at the firelight on the sergeant's knuckles. He thought of the boy's eyes. He thought of the woman pouring water over a child's hair. "Yes, Sergeant," he said. He buttoned his pocket. That night he lay under a wagon, boards a low sky above his face, and watched smoke drift and thin until sleep took him. Days folded like worn cloth. The land changed slowly, then all at once. A wash of coarse grasses. A stand of cottonwoods clapping dry hands. A gully. A plain that seemed to begin at your toes and continue long after you stopped. Snow came one morning and laid white handprints along the road. The cold made the soldiers' voices sharp. At noon, a man up ahead slowed and sat down on the ground as if a chair had been placed for him. His daughter, a woman with hair like glossy rope, spoke to him low. He placed his hand on his chest and did not get up. The column parted around him like water finding an easy path. Michael went to the sergeant. He will not move." He did not add the rest. "Bring him to the wagon," the sergeant said. Already looking away. "He is gone," Michael said. Though the sergeant did not need the word, Amos saw the daughter's face and recognized the shape of it from his own winter. He stepped down, led his horse over and said, "Give me a rope." He did not wait for permission. He made a sling and the daughter helped him. Together they carried the weight to the side. She took off her shawl, folded it, and placed it beneath her father's head. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not. Amos swallowed the old taste of a churchyard. There was no singing that night. Most nights there was something. Thin as it was, a strand of sound drawn through the fingers of the dark. A child's hum, a rhythm tapped on a wagon board with a fingernail, a woman's voice turning one word into another. Not that night. The silence had weight. "Sometimes sorrow wants to be seen," the boy's mother said when he asked why the fire seemed louder. "Sometimes it needs to sit in the open so it does not grow teeth." He nodded, not understanding and yet keeping the thought as if it were a smooth stone for his pocket. When the column reached a river, the banks were crumbled and the water brown, carrying the color of the earth like proof. Men cut willow and made things that hoped to be bridges. Small children rode in wagons, faces stiff with cold like carved dolls. Older children waded, gripping ropes, water snatching at their legs. A woman slipped and went down. The current took her shawl and spun it away like a bird. She came up with hair slicked to her skull, eyes huge and empty. Amos moved without thinking, put his horse between her and deeper water, the animal shaking with cold. Michael reached her and pushed her toward the near shore with both hands, guiding her like someone who has not forgotten she is made of bones and not smoke. She stumbled out, fell to her knees, and made a sound like a reed. On the far bank, in a brief patch of sun, the boy's mother unwrapped the little pouch. She touched the corn kernels as if they were sleeping children. "I will plant you," she whispered. "I will put your feet in home." The boy watched, and the words lit something inside him that warmed the places the cold could not touch. They walked. Boots wore out. Sandals surrendered. A child carried a doll made from a corn husk with a strip of woven belt for hair. One morning the doll was not in her hand. She looked back, but the trail did not look back. She did not cry. She put her hand into her mother's shawl and gripped fabric. A trader's wagon met them near a place where the road widened enough to pretend it was a meadow. The trader smiled like someone whose teeth were owed money. He opened a box and showed a woman a shawl the color of rain at night. She touched it with 2 fingers, then watched him like he might pull the cloth away and reveal a snake. He tapped the side of his nose and told the sergeant that more goods would be along soon, which was not a promise anyone could spend. Amos watched and felt the small itch under his ribs he got when someone tried to sell what was not theirs to sell. He went back to the wheel and crouched. The split had lengthened. He soaked the rawhide and pulled it until it sang in his hands, then wrapped the spoke tight. He talked to the wheel the way his father had talked to things he mended, low, more sound than words, as if telling the object it was not alone. He tied the strip and stood. When he turned, the boy was there. "Thank you," the boy said in careful English, the kind learned by studying the shape of other mouths. "For the river," Amos blinked. "Anyone would have helped." The boy tilted his head. "Not anyone. What is your name?" The boy hesitated, then offered the name the soldiers used when they tried to list him. "Little boy," he said, rolling his eyes at the smallness of it and accepting it because there was no other word the army would write down for him. "Amos," the soldier said, touching his chest, and then, without thinking, the buttoned pocket where he kept his softer parts. "You keep walking," Amos added. "I will keep walking," the boy said, like a plan and a spell at once. The place called Fort Sumner rose from the plain like something the land had not agreed to. The river there did not taste right. It left a film on the tongue like ash. The soldiers called it the Pecos. The people had other names for what water should be. The army had built rooms that looked like boxes spaced too far apart. They strung wire, set up posts, and told people where to stand. They handed out flour that smelled sour and bacon that tasted of old salt. They handed out rules like nails and expected the world to hang from them. The boy's mother took the kernels to a strip of ground near a ditch where men had been ordered to push water. The ditch's sides kept falling in, like earth refusing to make a path for water that had turned against sweetness. Still there was dampness. She knelt, pressed her fingers into the gritty soil, and made small pockets. She placed each kernel like a guarded memory. She covered them gently and pressed the soil with her palm until it held the print of her hand. "Wake when you can," she said. The boy watched. He had dug at the ditch that morning until the skin of his palms made new maps. He had drunk water that left his lips coated in something that felt invisible but present. He had watched a man spit and spit, trying to rid himself of a taste that would not go. Still, when his mother placed the corn in the ground, a warmth shifted under his breastbone like a small animal turning toward light in sleep. It was not a camp built for thriving. The wind found corners and worried them apart. Winter came stubborn, summer arrived bright and brittle, full of tiny stinging things. People got sick. Some recovered, some did not. A child's cough became a man's. A woman who had carried a loom in her mind since she was a girl found a stick and string and taught her fingers the path again. An old man made a flute out of reed and played when guards looked away, notes walking a narrow line between comfort and grief. A mother told a story with her hands about a girl who loved the taste of flowers so much that she forgot her feet and learned to live on air. Amos learned the roots that made his job, the least cruel version of itself. He learned to arrive with flour a few minutes before men with ledgers came to count mouths like sheep. He learned to look away when a woman hid a handful for someone not on the list. He learned to whittle a small wooden horse and leave it where a child might find it without knowing whose hand had given it. One day he found the boy in a line for salt, taller than last month, shoulders gathering the beginning of a man's breadth. "How does your corn do?" Amos asked, trying on gentleness. "It is stubborn," the boy said, and a smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "Good," Amos answered. "I like stubborn. Do you like this place?" the boy asked. He did not mean the buildings. He meant the taste of the river, the way the wind learned too many languages and none. Amos took a breath. Dust lifted and settled again. "I like the parts that are people," he said. "The rest I do not have to like." "We will go home," the boy said softly. Someday, Amos agreed, not sure if the word was a bridge or a lie, and wanting it to be something a person could walk across. The corn came up thin, careful. It put leaves into the air like quiet hands. The soil tried to talk it out of rising with bitter voices. The plants listened, as living things must, and then did it their own way anyway. When the first silk showed, small and yellow as a child's laugh, the boy's mother wept without sound and let the tears wash the stale taste from her tongue. Some soldiers took what they could because that was their custom. Others looked at a woman like her and saw something too strong to make war on. One with a crooked tooth fished for catfish in a bend of the river and gave the head to a boy, just because he had once been a boy who liked to watch things change. The sergeant loved ledgers with a fervor other men gave to hymns. Men far away sat at tables and signed the world with their names like they had invented paper. Michael stood between words and let them pass through him until he felt like a screen that could not hold its own shade. At night, he sat with the people and tried to say things that did not cut anyone. "I know," he would say. "I know," never sure which past or present self he meant. He watched a little girl braid her doll's hair with grass. He watched the mother show her how to tuck the end in so the braid would hold through sleep. He pressed his hands together and asked the air to remember these fingers, this ordinary and holy task. Sometimes rain came, smelling like dark earth waking. The water fell and then changed its mind and moved on. People ran out with bowls and turned faces upward. The river rose a little and then settled back into its bitter course. One summer, flood took the ditch at night. It carried away soil and the small huts the men had woven from willow. It took the corner of the grinding place, the pestles rolling off like drunks. In the morning, the corn lay tilted, roots exposed like pale hair, silk pressed flat. The boy's mother stood and put her hands on her hips the way her mother had done when a wind tore a window cloth, and she refused to let the tear become more important than the wall it lived in. She bent, set the roots back into their bed, and spoke the old names for water when it was a friend, and the new names she had for it when it tried to be a thief. The boy scooped mud out of the ditch with his hands and forearms, muscles slick and roped. Amos came with a shovel and a wordless shoulder. They worked until evening, forgot them, and then remembered them again. When they were done, the ditch looked like something men might have built on purpose, which is the closest you ever get to undoing a flood. "Sometimes I wish you had stayed in Missouri," Amos's friend Weller said by the fire that night, spitting tobacco like punctuation. "Sometimes I wish I had," Amos answered, and they both laughed, the sound easy and sad. "Why do you keep it this?" Weller asked after a while. "Because it does not stop just because I turn away," Amos said. "Because when I hand a woman a sack and she takes it like an insult she pretends to forgive, I might sleep without grinding my teeth. Because a boy told me he would keep walking, and I believed him." Weller nodded like a man who did not understand and loved his friend anyway. A fever moved into people that winter and refused to pay rent. The boy's mother's breath went tight in her chest and stuck there like a thorn. She stitched and then could not. She stood and then sat without meaning to. The boy brought water and it tasted like tin. He brought tea and it tasted like the memory of summer grass. He went to the doctor's tent and asked with words he had practiced, "What do you have for a woman who breathes like a bird trapped in a chimney?" he asked. The doctor looked tired in a way that did not belong to his body. "Not enough," he said, and found a tin anyway. "This for the fever, this for the cough." He did not say cure. That word had moved away years ago. Amos went to the chaplain and asked for a candle. He carried it to the edge of camp, set it on a flat stone, lit it, and spoke not to any one God, but to the stubbornness of light itself. The act of making a small thing stand up against the dark and insist. He had no right to ask for anything, and he did. And when the wind seemed to lean close, he whispered the simplest word he had, "Mother." The boy's mother pressed his hand between both of hers. Her palms felt like warm stones from a winter creek. "If I go," she said, no drama, no break in the voice, "carry home in your mouth. It will be safe there." "You will plant the corn in spring," he said, not because he believed saying made it so, but because sometimes words are bridges you walk to reach the other bank. "Even if you must come back, I will plant it," she said with a small smile, because she had taught him how to talk to the world and respected the effort. "But if I do not, you plant it. When you put it in the ground, talk to it like it is me. When it grows, you will have something that listens the way I do." He nodded because his mouth had no more room for what he wanted to say. It was full with the weight of carrying. She slept and woke and slept again, like a tide that had lost its clock. The fever went like a visitor who tells too long a story. The cough stayed and learned their names. Near sunset, when light was a thin stripe along the wall of the shelter, she touched his cheek and said, "Walk until the dust remembers you." Then she closed her eyes the way you close a door gently so you do not wake the baby in the next room. He did what she asked. He put the words in his mouth and carried them. He walked the camp until his feet made a map he could see with his eyes closed. Turn left at the ditch, right at the place where guards told the same 3 jokes, straight to the corner where Michael sat with his head in his hands, and then to the wagon where Amos slept with one arm over his eyes like a man blocking out a too bright morning. Spring came mean and then softened. The corn rose, green stubbornness, and reached for a sky that was not yet theirs and claimed it anyway. The army handed out seed that did not sprout and blamed the people for failing to coax life from stone. The people ate rabbits when they could catch them and shoes when they could not. Stories were told like small breads. Songs were hummed like quiet handshakes. Children grew into their bones to the sound of a river that did not love them. News came late and wrong, as it always did. Different uniforms in far places, papers signed and unsigned, flags that loved themselves more than wind. Words like surrender, reconstruct, treaty, and sovereign wore out people's ears. None of the words changed the taste of the water. None altered the way sunlight laid its hands on the back of the boy's neck when he bent to clear weeds from between corns. Feet. Michael heard talk you could hear if you pressed your ear to. The army's walls, talk that smelled like ink. He heard names he remembered from younger days when his mother wore a blue shawl and told him stories about a woman who made the earth out of her thoughts. He did not get excited. proud words at this place were like birds, circling, calling, seldom landing. One night Amos came to the boys' shelter and cleared his throat like a man announcing himself to a room he did not wish to disturb. "Walk with me," he said. They went to the edge of camp where the plain opened like a book that had swelled in the rain. The moon lay on the ground in shallow pools. The wind did its quiet sowing between stems of grass. Amos reached into his shirt and drew out a leather cord with the thin sky-colored stone. "She asked me to hold it," he said, placing it in the boy's palm. "She told me to give it back when you were not searching for her every time you turned around." The boy set the stone against his chest. The cool felt like the hand of a stream after a long walk. "I will always look for her," he said, plain as weather. "I know," Amos answered. He had one more thing to say and turned it in his mouth to check for sharp edges. "There is talk of an end to this," he said. "Papers, maps, maybe home." The boy held his breath long enough to hold a whole prayer, then let it go. When the breath came back, it tasted different, like the first sip of coffee on a cold morning. "When?" he asked, not impatient, only ready to sit on the porch of the idea and wait. "I do not know," Amos said, grateful the boy had not asked him to be God. It came all at once, as impossible things do, after being impossible for just long enough to make hope feel foolish. Men spread maps like butcher paper and smoothed them with flat hands. They spoke words that felt like meal mixed with bone dust. They pointed at places by names those places did not answer to. They pressed their fingers down and said, "This." The earth, older and more patient than them, suffered it. "Treaty," Michael said out loud, tasting the syllables like a stone and not sure if it was smooth or sharp. He translated the parts the army wanted heard, and then the parts he would want if he were a later version of himself looking back. He watched faces, skepticism and hope wearing the same mask. The boy stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had taught him to read the way floodwater looks before it chooses its path, with women who measured thread with their forearms, with children who learned to walk on soil that interfered. He held the sky-colored stone and imagined a line drawn from its spark to the blue above and down again to the green his mother had coaxed from salt. He imagined living inside that shape. The day the walk home began, the air smelled different. Not like welcome exactly, but like a room that had been closed too long and was finally opened. Dust lifted under their feet as if an old friend had come out to meet them halfway. Guards counted, made marks, wrote numbers that ignored names. People gathered what wind and hunger had not managed to steal. A dented pot, a comb, a doll whose hair had been replaced with string, a scrap of cloth that had covered babies and bread and faces. Amos tightened the repaired wheel one last time and stood beside his horse. Weller came to stand with him. "You feel that?" Weller asked, voice lowered. "What?" "Like the land took a breath," Weller said and shook his head. "I must be a fool." "If so," Amos answered, "I am your kind of fool." He did not salute. He did not remove his hat. He stood like a man outside a church on a day with bells. Michael walked with the people as far as the edge of what the army said was his job, and a little past that out of habit. He spoke softly to a woman and laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because the air had done something to his chest, and laughter was the nearest tool. On a low rise, he stopped and watched them go. He pressed both hands flat to the bony ground, as if he could feel their footsteps through the stone. The boy stepped onto the road. The stone lay warm against his chest. The little pouch his mother had guarded sat tucked into his belt. He carried its weight like an answer. The line moved. Lines always move. That is their nature. Behind them, the river was a bitter ribbon. Ahead, there were others. Some that would taste right, some that needed time, some that might never be sweet again. He walked. He looked back once and saw the fort sitting like a dull tooth in the wide mouth of the plain. Then he looked forward. The land he knew lay at the edge of his bones, quiet as a memory you do not want to startle. "Mother," he said softly, as if telling the air a name so it could call him by it when needed. He began to hum the planting song she had used, low and steady. Around him, other voices lifted, the small, the old, the tight-throated voices that would not come out for guards and ledgers, but would for open horizon and light. The wind wove through them like a comb, pulling the strands together, making a thing. They went on for miles that did not care what miles were. Sunlight laid warm hands on their shoulders. The earth gave a little underfoot and then held. A child pointed at a hawk and said a wrong word, and her father corrected her gently and did not take the miracle out of the moment. The line stretched and bunched and stretched again, its rhythm learning them, their rhythm learning it. On the second day, a girl's laughter struck the air like a spark off flint. It surprised even her. She covered her mouth as if to keep it from escaping. Her mother, who had spent years saying be quiet in 1,000 different ways, did not say it then. She let the sound move. It ran around a man's name and made it easier to carry. At noon, the boy walked in a patch of shade made by a too small cloud that tried anyway. He looked down and saw his footprints in dust that had already known other feet and would again. He could not see yesterday's marks. He could not see any that would last. He thought of his mother pressing corn into earth and telling it to wake. He pressed his palm against his chest and felt the stone, cool and old and stubborn, older than maps and soldier talk. In the late light, when the far mesas took on the color of rust and smoke, the boy's mother's words returned, clear as if someone had just spoken. Walk until the dust remembers you. He listened to the shuffle and scuff of hundreds of feet. He listened to the slow breath of the line. He listened to the wind move across the skin of the land. He could not prove that dust remembers. He did not need to. He walked, and the dust lifted and settled. Soft as breath, keeping the story the way dust keeps everything, just under the surface, waiting for the light to strike at the right angle, waiting for the feet to come again, waiting to rise. Ruth Carrick had lined her shawl with a strip of old ticking that winter, and by April, its stitched edge had grown soft and round from the press of her fingers. She kept her bank passbook beneath that edge as she walked, as if warmth might seep through cloth and paper both. Dawn had not yet cleared the masts at the East River when she turned onto Wall Street and found a line already curling along the stones. Men with whiskers dew-wet, women with shawls like hers. A boy asleep on a flour sack, and his mother looking past him at the shuttered windows of the savings bank. There were candles still guttering behind the panes of the counting house next door, and somewhere farther down a horse kicked and rang iron against iron like a warning bell. The cobbles smelled of rainwater and yesterday's ashes. It was the 10th day of April, and New York City wore the faint, raw breath of a spring that could not quite lift its head. The passbook was blue and stiff and proud in her hand, a thing she had shown to no one. Not even when the women at the sewing circle discussed their husbands and how much each kept back from the week's wages. Ruth had no husband. For 3 years she had sewn collars and cuffs and the scalloped edges of pillowcases by lamplight, eyes burning over thread so fine she sometimes pinched air and did not notice until the needle drew blood. $27 were written in the book in a clerk's careful hand. $27 had a weight to it when stacked in coin on a table. $27 if they let you keep it meant a stove without fear of the coal running low, a few months' rent, a little more meat in the stew. She pressed the book, and the ticking lining pressed back. And she found a spot in the line behind a carter whose coat smelled like rope and river and the sour sweetness of molasses. "You're early," he said over his shoulder, friendly, without asking anything. "Or I'm late. Early," Ruth said. "For safety's sake, I heard." "Well, I heard," he nodded. "Everybody heard." He lifted a hand, knuckles cracked white with cold, and gestured at the street. "Never seen so many people who don't want to be here." Across from them, a coffee house had opened its doors and was pouring bitter stuff into tin cups, and men went in shaking their heads and came out shaking them still. From the counting house with the candles, a young man stepped into the doorway and looked down the line the way a sailor studies weather. He had the thin, pale face of a clerk and the unfashionable brown of a coat worn for work instead of show. At his wrist, his cuffs were dark with ink that would not wash no matter how hard he scrubbed. In the light behind him, ledgers rose in a block on a desk, their foredges foxed and striped. He said something to another clerk in the gloom and went inside again. When he returned, there was a tray in his hands with a pair of scales. Brass shining, pans cupped like open palms, a little nest of test weights catching the candle's tremor. Specie, the carter said, trying the word as if it were a foreign coin. If they give any at all. Name's Eli, by the by. Ruth, she said, and held out an honest hand that had been washed twice that morning and still carried the faintest bloom of soap. Pleased, Eli said, till we see how pleased we really are. He tipped his chin toward the counting house. You think that's your bank? She shook her head. Mine is farther on. She did not want him to see the name stamped on the passbook. It felt like saying a prayer out loud before you knew if God was listening. As the sun rose, it did so slow and unwilling, light smearing like tallow along the street. More people came. Someone spoke the name of the Morris Canal and Banking Company as if it were a man who had slipped away owing money. The name went down the line and came back stripped to Morris, and then to nothing. A newsboy darted in and out of the crush with papers limp over his arm. Crisis, he shouted. Bank's in trouble. Cotton falling. Specie circular to blame. Buy now or ask your neighbor. Crisis. He was swallowed by men who did not buy, who only looked at the black words as if they were the smoke that had hung over the city the winter before when the exchange burned. Smoke that left a taste in the mouth and would not leave. At the door with the scales, the young clerk came out again, this time with a tin sign. He nailed it to the lintel while the line watched. The sound of the hammer against the wood was bright and thin and mean. The sign was blank, or seemed so at first. Then a breath of wind turned it slightly and the letters stood up, tipped in black. Eli squinted and read, lips moving. Payments in coin as usual. He laughed, a single short bark. As usual, he said to Ruth. What a polite way to lie. They're still paying, she said. Look, at another window. A woman stepped away with her hands closed against her chest as if they were cold, and when she reached the street, she opened them and stared at the small, neat stack of silver as if she'd never seen anything so bright. She did not move until the man behind her touched her shoulder and said, Miss? Miss, she did not answer. She only gathered the silver again and folded it into a shawl's corner and knotted the tail around the knot she always used, and she went away very quickly. Ruth pushed her passbook deeper under her shawl. The line crept. A man in front of Eli, a cooper by the look of his hands, turned and said, You hear the British raise their rate? 6 to 7% makes the toffs pull in credit. He said credit as if it were a creature with a face and teeth. Then Mr. Van Buren sits in Washington while the notes here flutter like laundry. What did the circular say? Gold and silver for land only, as if paper weren't paper enough. Reckless, that's what I call it. Reckless one way and reckless another. Reckless everywhere, Eli said. My mate says the cotton men in New Orleans can't pay their drafts. And their drafts pay us, and here we are. What I heard, Ruth said, and it surprised her how readily she said it. How easily she made herself part of a we, is that the banks put too much paper into the streets last year, and now the paper is turning back into rags, which is what it was. The cooper looked at her with respect that had nothing to do with her shawl. That's so, he said. They moved 3 steps forward and stopped. A man ran past them with no hat and no coat, though the morning had a bite to it still, his hair slicked down with water as if he had washed in a hurry and not dried. Closed, he shouted at the line, amused and breathless and foolish. Closed, the lot of them. And he laughed and stumbled and went on, making people nervous, which some were already. Not ours, Eli said, gently for her sake. Not mine, Ruth said, and believed it because the alternative was a sudden dark that fell so quickly she could not look at it. Inside the counting house with the sign, the young clerk who had hammered it into place stood at his station and tried to make his hands move with the calm he had learned. His name was Jonas Fitch. The brass scale pans had a memory for the ring of silver. If a coin was cut or light or base, the sound was wrong, the balance off by a hair. He weighed Spanish milled dollars because they were honest by reputation. The saints and waves pressed into them by a hammer, a hemisphere away. He weighed half eagles because a $5 gold piece was a different kind of pledge in a man's palm. He set them down and watched the beam settle, neat as a ruler, then slid the coin toward his right hand and dropped it into a tin pitcher that muffled sound. The pitcher was half full. They would empty it into the vault once it was full. And the vault downstairs had a smell he had loved when he first started. Dry wood and steel and a little cold stone. A different air that seemed to weigh more. He had loved the vault most because that was where the bank's secret heart lay. And he had wanted to believe in secrets that were safe, in hearts that did not change. "Mr. Fitch," said the senior teller under his breath, "tell the porter to send up more halves." Jonas nodded and sent the message and kept his hands moving and did not look up at the window to see the line and the faces and the shawls. On other days he liked to look. He liked to find men who came to deposit, proud to turn crumpled notes into neat figures in a book. He liked the women who came to count out coins slower than the men would have, slower and more careful, as if every piece of silver needed to be remembered before it disappeared into paper or the ledger's black lines. Today the line was different, and when he looked up once against his better judgment, he found a man staring directly at him as if he had asked a question Jonas could not hear and was waiting for an answer. "Fitch," murmured the senior teller again, this time not for halves. "I want you to carry a message down when Mr. Doremus asks for it. He'll meet the directors after the exchange. Not a word. Don't let your eyes talk." He smiled a thin smile at his own joke and turned to a customer with a face that might have been cut from applewood. "Yes, sir," Jonas said, because he always said yes, sir. He had been a clerk for 2 years and liked it, with an intensity that embarrassed him when he tried to explain even to himself. He liked paper that stayed where you told it. He liked the geometry of neat columns. He liked the scales line finding level. He liked the city for its numbers. How many bales, how many barrels, how many banks. His father had swung a hammer on a riverboat and come home with his hand swollen and split. Jonas had gone upriver from that life into a counting house and thought he had found a safer sort of strength. At noon, the exchange emptied into Broad Street in a rain of voices. The men of the street, brokers, jobbers, factors, merchants, moved quickly in a weaving pattern that had its own laws. The old Tontine coffee house had weathered another winter of loud bargains and hot arguments. Men came now to the newer exchange, with its airy room and pillars and the ring of shoes on stone. A rumor was a thing you could smell before you could see it. Hotter air, raised breath, small bursts of laughter without humor. Jonas had learned how rumors traveled by watching the faces of men who did not look up from their sheets, how the corner of a mouth might dip when a price written in pencil had to be struck and rewritten. This noon, prices were not merely rewritten. They were rubbed into smears, rubbed until the paper pilled and tore. Morris, everyone called it Morris, though the words Canal and Banking Company came after, was said to be weak. The bank up on the west bank of the Hudson had been the strong friend of strong men. Its notes were everywhere in New Jersey. It had set up branches and written promises and taken promises. But today there was too much air under its name, and like any bridge, too much air meant the structure shook. Cotton drafts were not paid. In New Orleans, a man scowled at the river and told a clerk there would be no oil in his lamps that night if that was the cost of saving a bit more coin. In Philadelphia, a man with neat hair counted his private specie with his office door closed. In Boston, the Suffolk men frowned and talked low. In Washington, the new president smiled to someone who misread his quiet as calm. In the afternoon, a boy came to the bank with a message from a broker who had lines to draw and sums to settle and could not come himself. His hat was too big for him. He had borrowed it from his father. The message said that something had given way uptown and the nearest savings bank had shuttered for a recount of specie that might last overnight. It said the New England men were selling what they could. It said a man on the exchange floor had stood on a crate and torn a banknote in half and cheered and had not been cheered in return. Jonas watched Mr. Doremus read the message and fold it and put it in his pocket as if it were a handkerchief he might need later. Mr. Doremus had a face like the faces carved on ships. It looked as if wind had shaped it. By 3 o'clock, Ruth had reached the stone step under the window. When the clerk said next, she did not move at first because there was no one in front of her suddenly and motion felt like a luxury. Then she went forward and presented the book. She did not speak. The book spoke for her. The neat figures, the careful sums, the lines that said she had made those deposits and had not asked for them back. The clerk, he was not Jonas. Jonas worked at a larger window, took the book and read it, and looked up at her with a professional kindness that made her want to weep. She hated that her mouth moved before she could stop it. "Please," she said, "a small portion in coin, if you please." "How much?" the clerk asked, gently, because people had been vexed and sometimes rough today, and he had found that asking precisely meant the person before him felt seen as an individual, not merely as a throat in a crowd. $5, Ruth said. It was bold, but she had slept poorly and had sewn until midnight and had decided on that number as if choosing between medicines. 5 would leave 22 safe in the book. 5 would buy time. The clerk nodded and wrote neatly and reached to the pan and the weights. $2 silver, 2 more, then a half, another half. He was already thinking of the ledgers he would write at day's end, and of the figures he would carry over like careful luggage when a hand touched his arm. He looked up and found it was Mr. Doremus himself. The senior teller was behind him, face white around the nostrils. "Stop there," Mr. Doremus said, not loudly but with a voice the room heard. He took a breath and did something with his face that made it kinder than it had been. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning from the window, "we find ourselves constrained by pressures that are, I assure you, temporary. The bank will suspend payment in specie for the afternoon only to preserve parity and fairness for all depositors. We will reopen with coin tomorrow." The room changed shape. It did it without moving, and yet it moved. People who had been inching shifted. Those at the back surged without intent. The idea of money grew teeth and bit down. Somewhere a voice cracked on a curse. A woman said no, as if it were the first word she had learned. A man who had been calm put his fist on the wood as if he had put it on a shoulder that had betrayed him. "Tomorrow," he said, a chuckle rising from a place that was not humor. "Tomorrow," he said again, and the second time he made the word into a blade. Ruth's $2 and 2 more and the pair of halves, their milled edges bright as spines, lay on the counter. The clerk's hand hovered like a crane over water that might or might not be deep. Mr. Doremus saw them and paused and leaned, and perhaps because of the way Ruth's fingers were spread, perhaps because there are moments when pride has room to make an exception, he said, "Complete that payment, Fitch." "I'm Brent." "Sir," the clerk said automatically, and realized as he said it that Mr. Doremus had been looking not at him, but past him at Jonas. He flushed and slid the coins forward. "Ma'am," he said to Ruth, "you have a good day." A sentence that was foolish and earnest both. Her hand closed on silver. It surprised her how light it was. She had brought up from the country once a sack of apples that weighed more than this fortune. It made a hard little warmth in her palm, and the warmth made her giddy with gratitude she did not want to show. She did not make it out the door before something pressed from behind, and she had to clutch her shawl and the coins together and wedge herself sideways like a fish moving upstream. When she reached the street, Eli found her, she did not know how, and put his wide body to her narrow one as a shield. "You get it?" he asked and snorted. "Stupid question." He did not ask how much. A gentleman would have with a certain tone. A brute would have too. Eli was neither. "Come the morning," he said, "they'll do what they'll do. Men like that. Well, come on. I can stand you a drink that's not beer." "I can spare the penny," she said, feeling grand and ashamed in the same breath. "You'll spare nothing," he said. "You tell me a thing to lift and I'll lift it. That's how we'll settle accounts." They sat in the coffee house at a table with a leg that wobbled until Eli folded a bit of newsprint and wedged it, and then it wobbled less. Ruth set the coins on the table just long enough to look at them, and then, feeling a mad fear that someone could pluck them with 2 fingers and run, she wrapped them in the same pattern the woman earlier had used, twice around and twice back, a knot made with a grace that came only of use. She slid the knot under the ticking at her ribs and let her fingers stay there longer than needed, as if she could still feel silver through wool and cotton and skin. Jonas watched them from the counting house window without meaning to. He saw the woman and the carter and the way she wrapped the coins and the way he did not look at her doing it. It struck him as a picture he would remember later, perhaps when the air in the vault had gone from good to sour. Mr. Doremus spoke to him and he started. "Fitch," he said, and when Jonas looked up he saw the old man's eyes were not ship's bows after all, but something else. Something like a man who has carried a crate up a long hill and found at the top only another hill. "You'll take a note to the directors at 8. The rest will be closed today." "Yes, sir," Jonas said. On your way, Mr. Dormus said. Buy a paper and read every word that feels like a knife. The days that followed did not fall like dominoes. They were irregular, and in the gaps between them fear grew. Many banks put up little signs like the one Jonas had hammered, each with its own politeness. Some said temporary, some said until further notice. Some said nothing at all and only narrowed their windows to a slit through which a voice could pass but no coin. Men who had bought land with paper stood on their porches and stared into fields that would not change their minds for them. In the Bowery, a speech was given by a man whose boot soles were fresh tarred. He spoke about liberty and went home to a bed he had paid for with a note he hoped would not be questioned. In February, there had been the flower riot. A barrel spilled in the street, its pale dust a bright cloud against the winter air, men slapping their hands at it as if flour could be caught with skin. Now there was not a riot, not one thing. There was 100 small riots in the stomachs of men and women who were not certain what tomorrow meant. Eli's carting work thinned as ships delayed and merchants hedged. Men who hired him had grown careful. A barrel that had always been worth the lift might not be if the coin promised for it came slow at week's end or not at all. Soon, a man said to him on a Thursday, holding out a hand palm up and empty as if it were proof. Next week. Eli had heard next week in the war and in the days after and had never liked it. He did not argue. He gathered the harness, patted the horse as if the horse needed assurance, and drove home past a line outside a bank and past a man outside a baker who had changed his prices with chalk 3 times in one day. He saw a sign above a shop that said, "Hard times tokens accepted." Cheap copper made into coins by men who did not have the right to mint and had taken it anyway. He bought one with a picture of a ship and held it in his palm and could not decide whether it was an honest lie or a dishonest truth. He took it to Ruth that evening like a gift and held it out so she could see its crude strike. They sat by her window in a light that had a kind of tenderness to it, as if night understood that 2 people were trying not to be lonely. "It's handsome," she said, which it was in a rough way. Handsome like a man who has washed his face at a pump and combed his hair with his fingers. "It's nothing," Eli said, "but maybe it can buy a heel of bread." "It might buy a story," she said. "You know, for the boy in the alley who will not sleep unless he believes he is traveling somewhere in his head." She smiled a little crooked. "If you give me that, I'll make a ship voyage of it. The token ship. We'll sail until morning, and in the morning there will be coffee and a biscuit hard as pewter." He laughed. "You'd make a fine preacher, Miss Ruth." "A preacher of ships," she said. "We all sail and some of us dock." Jonas stayed late at the bank 3 nights running, copying lists and adding columns. Mr. Dormus had him write "suspended" in red beside entries that for years had been black. He carried notes to directors whose houses were heavy with drapes and silence. He stood once in a vestibule and heard a woman crying in another room, and the sound made him flush with shame that he could not put proper names to. It had something to do with the way he had loved the vault, the neatness, the safe heart. Now he knew hearts went hungry. When he slept, he dreamed of scales that would not find true. The needle trembling and never lying still. On the 5th day, he carried a letter 3 blocks farther than usual and, at a corner, saw Ruth. He did not know her name, but he knew her face and the way she had wrapped her coins, and he knew, too, the carter, who was reading something to a boy who leaned in with his mouth open as if the air could make words faster. Jonas hesitated because he had no right to stop, and because stopping seemed to him a small treason against the urgency in his pocket. He stopped anyway. When the boy ran off because boys always have somewhere to go in the city, he approached the pair with his hat in his hand. "I work at Doremus," he said without preface because another preface would have felt untrue. "I shouldn't say anything, but if you have, if anyone you know has deposits they don't immediately need, they should leave them on the page. Most banks will pay again in time." He did not like how weak the word "most" felt. It wobbled like a table leg, and he didn't know what to wedge under it. "Your kindness is a sort of coin," Ruth said, and inclined her head. "I took $5 on the day and left the rest." "Wise?" Jonas said, "though I don't know what wisdom is now." He looked down at his hands, at the ink that lived in the lines. "Forgive me, my name is Jonas Fitch. I am Ruth," she said. "And this is Eli." The carter nodded. He had a way of looking at a man that told you he already knew what you were going to say and would not hold it against you for saying it. "You look like you haven't been outside for a week," Eli said. "Men who don't lift forget they have legs. Come and take a walk later. We'll show you a river that's free." "Free," Jonas said, and laughed because he could not help it. He promised he would try, and one evening he did. They walked to the battery, where the water smelled of tar and fish, and a sweetness that came from somewhere upriver, and the wind made white triangles on the chop. If conversation was a sort of coin, they spent freely and did not ask for change. Jonas told them about the old man who had stood in the lobby and refused to raise his voice while a mob formed around him, and how the mob had fallen back before his quiet. Eli told them how shipping men could tell a real sailor by the way he watched the water when there was nothing to see on it. A man who watched the water because he liked the way it moved could be trusted. Ruth told them about a spool of thread that had rolled under a dresser and stayed there for a week, and how, when she finally dragged it out with a fork, she had felt like a miner dragging ore from a seam. Behind and around them, the city kept its nervous beat. A cart rattled over cobbles. A dog barked at gulls that pretended not to hear. Farther off, someone shouted, and the shout broke into laughter, and into anger, and then into nothing. A man sang a bit of a hymn and then stopped when he forgot the next line. Once, as they walked back, they passed the window of a counting house where a junior clerk, somebody like Jonas, was weighing coins by candlelight. The scales beam made a narrow shadow like a cat's tail on the wall. In May, the banks closed the doors for real. They did it all on the same day, and the newspapers called it suspension of specie. And the men who had hammered polite signs now nailed up signs without adjectives. By order of the directors, until measures can be adopted. Prompt. Attention will be paid to all appropriate business. The words were courteous in the way. Someone is courteous when he does not know your name and does not want to learn it. For 3 days afterward, the streets felt like a theater after the curtain has fallen, and the audience does not want to leave because it cannot believe the story is over. Men who had socks full of coins slept poorly because safety is heavy. Men whose socks were empty slept poorly for other reasons. On the morning when the banks posted the truth, Jonas put on his brown coat and went not to the counting house, but to the savings bank where Ruth had deposited her one careful fortune. He did not know what he meant to do: steal nothing, promise nothing, offer something that would not make him a liar. When he reached the door, he found Ruth sitting on the top step, her shawl tight around her shoulders despite the mildness of the day. She was reading a scrap of newspaper aloud, and the words were plain enough that he could hear them without moving closer. Suspension, May 10. One of the worst panics in the history of our country. She folded the scrap into a square and put it under the passbook, as if paper could protect paper. "Miss Ruth," he said. It was not how he would have addressed a customer at a window. It was how he addressed a person who looked a little like someone he knew in a place that was something like home. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I came to see the sign I already knew would be there." "It is a handsome sign," he said softly, looking at the gold leaf on the letters. As if that mattered. A man could stand only so long without moving and still be honest. He sat beside her. For a minute they did not speak. The street moved around them with a motion that made their stillness feel chosen. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words small coins he wished were heavier. "This is not a kindness that can be forced upon you, but if you will allow it, I would like to lend you." She shook her head, not impatient. "We do not yet know whether we are drowning," she said. "A swimmer who takes your hand too soon can pull you under. I have what I took, and I have work. People always need buttons even when they do not need collars. And I have a friend who can lift very heavy things. I can do that," Eli said from behind them, and they turned. He had come silent as a man who knows how to keep a cart from rattling on a Sunday. "What are we lifting?" "Only our stubbornness," Ruth said and smiled. "I think it weighs as much as a barrel of flour," Eli shrugged. "I've lifted flour and worse. Flour falls apart when you put it down, though." "Stubbornness doesn't," Jonas said, and surprised himself by laughing again, the same involuntary spring laugh he'd given at the word free. It meant something that his body could still make that sound without asking permission from his head. Summer came slow, and then all at once, the way summers do in cities that store heat like coal. The sun fell down into the streets in flat gold tiles every afternoon. Men took off their coats and revealed shirts with patches neatly done by wives and sisters. Women washed, wrung, and pinned those shirts to lines that made progress in 2 ways at once, a block and a day. The city's water tasted a little like metal, and the rumors tasted like metal too. A savings bank reopened and closed again. A warehouse stood empty and then, without warning, full of bales nobody wanted to carry. On the river, a man's body was fished out with no particular ceremony. He had a banknote in his pocket that, when dried, became 2 notes and then disintegrated. There was no story there, not one anyone could tell cleanly, so they did not tell it. They said he had slipped. Ruth kept her routines like beads. She rose early and stitched until her eyes complained, and she soothed them with a rag dipped in cool water. She walked on Sundays to the Battery and did not spend a penny. She saved candle stubs and melted them into one thin candle. Once, on a day when the heat lay on her like an extra layer of clothes, she took the knot of silver from its place and untied it, and set the coins in a line on the table, and looked at them until their faces swam, and she could not tell saint from ship. Then she wrapped them again and put them back, and told herself she had done a useful thing, that they were safer for having been counted again. When her landlady raised the rent a little, she did not argue. The landlady had her own ledger, scratched by the work of a life that had taught her which rooms collected tenants and which collected dust. Ruth sent a $50 to a woman she had known on the street where she had lived when she first came to the city, because that woman's baby coughed at night, and there are loans that are not about money. Eli learned the habit of taking 2 jobs for the pay of 1, the wharf and the barrow and the freight. The freight and the errand, each paying just enough that, when you stitched them together, the seam held. He learned where the shade fell on the street at 2 o'clock and where at 4, which alleys offered a breeze that did not smell like fish guts, and which always did. He learned to tell from the sound a man's voice made whether the coin he promised would appear. He kept his cart greased and his horse fed even when he could not afford meat for his own stew. A horse is a partner who does not begrudge partnership. He kept an eye out for Jonas in the evenings too, not because he had taken a liking to clerks, but because he had taken a liking to this clerk in particular. A man who stared at scales like a navigator and who could be made to laugh by words like free and stubbornness. And Jonas, in a city where so many things now commanded him to sit and copy and obey, began to stand at his window after his supper and practice doing nothing. It was a discipline like any other. He watched men walk with chins up and men walk bowed. He watched women count their steps between home and pump and make the same turn every day with the same flick of a skirt. He thought about the vault and was not sure anymore whether it had been a place he loved for itself or for what it had allowed him to believe about order. One evening he took his account of his own savings, meager, because clerks are paid what clerks are paid, and he bought not a thing but a lesson. He paid a printer $2 to teach him how to set type and pull a proof on a little hand press. The printer laughed and said, "All these men who want to set the world in type." But he took the coin and showed Jonas how to place a line, how to mirror the words that would print true. Jonas went home with ink on his fingers that did not match the bank's ink and did not wash out any easier, and felt as if he had done a thing that made a dent in the day. In October, after a summer that had bitten and a September that had chewed, the city began to talk about resumption the way shy people talk about a dance, with hope that has learned to be careful. A bank paid out a little silver. A shop took a note without a sigh. Some days breathed easier. Some did not. There were men who would never return to their work because their work had been a column of numbers in someone else's head, and that head had decided the column could be erased. There were men who found new work that they liked better, and men who found new work that they liked less and took anyway. On a Sunday, Ruth sat in her church and listened to a sermon about providence that was gentle in its broad way, and thought that providence might be another word for the way Three people sometimes sit together and eat a stew that is too thin and, despite that, tastes thick because of who is at the table. One of those Sundays they ate at Eli's boarding house, a place with a courtyard that caught wind like a bowl. The stew was dark and good, and a boy came to the doorway and stared in, and Eli sent him away with a heel of bread so hard he could have sanded wood with it. "You'll break your teeth," he warned, and the boy grinned all gap and possibility and said, "Then I'll get grown-up teeth better than these," and ran. After the boy had gone, they sat a minute with the quiet a good meal makes. "What will you do?" Ruth asked Jonas, "if a bank is not the thing you should be doing?" "I can count," he said. "God help me, that's what I know. But counting is not only for banks. I might count bales for a warehouseman who says he has no coin and yet has a way of paying in the long run. I might set type halfway straight. I might teach a boy to read a ledger who will someday make better use of it than I have." "You do more than count," she said. "You notice. You stand in a place where the world tells itself the truth and you decide whether to record it plainly. That's a choice, not a habit." He held her gaze because it would have been cowardly to look away. "Today," he said, "I watched a man try to draw a dollar that isn't there, and I told him no. It felt like turning down a beggar at my own door, and yet it is not my door. It is a door I rent." "We all rent our doors," Eli said, not unkind. "Some months we pay on time, some we pay late, some we move because we cannot pay at all. But a door is a door only so long as we can open it." Ruth reached into the seam of her shawl and drew out the knot she had tied in April. She set it on the table and undid it with fingers that did not shake. She laid the coins down in the light from the courtyard, each one a round question. "I will put these back," she said, "when they let me. Not because I trust them, but because I need a place to put a thing while I do something else. And I will take them again, and put them again. And if I do it quietly enough, perhaps no one will think to stop me." "If you want," Jonas said, "I will walk with you tomorrow and stand in the line like a tall post that the wind can lean on." "I would like that," she said. "And if you can spare the time, you can stop at the printers and tell him he undercharged you by $1 last month." And she smiled an apology for her trick. "I asked him what he'd taught you, and he told me he'd hardly taught you anything because you already knew what letters were for." He was embarrassed and pleased, and embarrassed to be pleased. "I'll bring him the $1, he said. "You'll bring it to me," she said, and when he looked at her, she smiled more. "I need a new kettle. Printers boil their water, I am told, and I will be happy to boil mine too." He understood and laughed and promised, and kept the promise. The kettle sat on her stove like a sober guest. It steamed in the morning with a burble that sounded like a man trying to hum and failing and trying anyway. Resumption came like a shy guest too. The banks opened their drawers and let silver show its bright face, not piles, not yet, but neat little stacks that said, "Here, this is not dead after all." The city exhaled, and then inhaled again sharply because the damage had been done all the same and would not be undone by one bright morning or 10. Men moved to Ohio to work land they hoped would not punish them for the hunger of a year. Men moved to the docks and moved from them again. Shops changed hands quietly. Women ran more of them. Down in New Orleans, the long rope of cotton ran from bales that were not as valuable as they had been. Up in Boston, the mills took in what they could and paid what they must, and stared at their inventories with a housewife's narrowed eye. In New York, on a day that tasted like fall, the air with a little iron in it again, the way it had in April but cleaner, Ruth stood once more at a window with her passbook. Behind her, a man told a story about the Great Fire of '35 and how he had watched the exchange go up and how, when they built the new one, he had stood in the street just to see if stone could truly erase the memory of flame. "It cannot," he said to no one in particular. "It only puts a new story on top of the old." A boy behind him asked if that meant we live in a stack of stories like boxes, and the man said yes, and sometimes the bottom one gives, and sometimes it doesn't. When Ruth's turn came, Jonas was at the window. He had moved from Doramus to the savings bank, partly because he had wanted to stand where her passbook stood, and partly because banks liked hiring clerks who had seen a panic and not run. He took the book, and saw the name that had not been more than an idea before, and wrote an entry with an ink that flowed better than the Doremus ink. He took the coins she laid down and weighed a half out of habit, and then laughed at himself for it and did not weigh the others. He did not speak the words a clerk sometimes says to make a ritual sound official. He looked up and said only, "Welcome back." And though he knew how small that was against the weight of the year, he meant it with his whole heart. She made her deposits in sums that were odd and human. $1.75, $2 and a token because the teller took them now and then for the draw and gave her a smile in exchange. Eli came sometimes too with a single hard-earned $half that looked wrong in his big hand, as if it should have been larger by natural right. They ate together on Wednesdays because it made the middle of the week feel less like a fence and more like a bridge. They discovered that city gossip was better than politics for the appetite, and that when you reduced a large fear to the shape of the room you sat in, that fear sometimes lost weight. Years later, men would name other panics and crashes with numbers and dates that sounded like hotel room numbers. 57, 73, 93. The great men's names would be tied to them like ship's flags. A boy would ask his father what had happened in 37, and the father would say, "There was a year when coin hid and notes fluttered, and we stood in lines and learned how quiet can be a kind of noise." He would say, "We learned who would say please and who would say now." He would tell the boy that the republic had not ended, because ending is a sharper thing than most countries allow themselves, but that it had staggered and put out its hand and found a railing and taken one careful step at a time. He would tell the boy a story about a kettle that steamed like a man humming, and about a hard times token that bought not bread but a bedtime voyage. And the boy would listen and think the old days were made of stories, because he would be too young to know that all days are. On the anniversary of the day the polite signs went up, Jonas closed his ledger at noon and went out to the street with a feeling that had something like gratitude in it. He walked to the Battery and found Eli there throwing crumbs to gulls and pretending to scowl when they took them with greedy necks. And he found Ruth 2 benches over with her work in her lap and her eyes not on her work, but on the water. They made a shape at the edge of the city that the city did not notice, because cities rarely notice anything but themselves. The air had the cool edge of a year turning over. The river did what rivers do, which is pretend to go one way while truly going another. And the wind did what wind does, which is remind people they are smaller than they think. "Do you remember?" Ruth asked. "That man who ran down the street shouting, 'Closed, closed,' as if he were delivering good news?" "I remember wanting to trip him," Eli said. "But I was carrying a sack, and a sack cannot be dropped without a reckoning." "I remember the scales," Jonas said. "The needle that would not settle until it did." He sighed, the kind of sigh that is not entirely sad. "I have set a great many needles since." "We keep steady," Eli said. "Or we try." "There are days," Ruth said, "when the kettle sings on the stove, and I think that steadiness is not a thing a person is, but a thing a person does." "That's true," Jonas said. "And a counter is only a counter when there are hands on both sides." They sat together a while, saying little because little needed saying. When a gust lifted the edges of Ruth's work, she smoothed it with her palm and, without looking, slipped her other hand into the shawl where the ticking edge had worn soft and, by habit, touched the place where paper lived. The passbook lay there, blue and proud and ordinary, and for a moment she thought she could feel through cloth and cotton and skin the ghost weight of silver that was no longer hers to carry, and, as she sat in the clean light that made the harbor look newly washed, she thought how a city survives. By 1,000 small balances found and kept, 100 quiet choices that did not make the papers. The gulls cried and the wind moved, and somewhere down on Wall Street a clerk set a coin on a scale, and the beam trembled and nodded and came to rest. The fire in the cabinet room crackled like a thing afraid to speak too loudly. Frost needled the windows from the corners inward, feathering in a slow white creep that reminded me of handwriting. The rooms in this city all wrote in winter. Everything left a mark, even the breath. The long table had been rubbed with beeswax until it kept the lamplight like a river, hard and glossy. The chairs waited with their narrow backs and their careful spindles. I was early because clerks should always be early, because it calms the men who make decisions to find someone already there, to set out papers and pour water and not ask questions. I had sharpened 3 quills to the same point and laid them in a little row beside my ledger. The room smelled of walnut oil, tallow, and pounded coal from the grates. When I ran a finger over the vellum page, the skin of it was cool and faintly greasy, as if the animal that had given it was still resisting a little, even after death. A gust nosed at the seams of the windows. The chimney gave a hollow thunk. The president's house always felt bigger than it looked from the street, as if the hallways uncurled only when they were needed. At that hour, just before dawn in the early 1800s, the corridors were mostly the domain of servants. Brisk footfalls, handbells, a muted clink of china inside a wicker carrier, the brush of skirts, some soft humming from the kitchen that did not carry words up, because words and steam have a pact. I took up a quill and tested it with a shape that wasn't a letter, a loop, 2 lines, a small bird. When the door latch moved, my shoulders squared without thinking. They came in with the morning dark still clinging to their coats. I will not pretend I was ever close to them. Clerks are furniture that answers, but proximity accumulates detail. The president carried the cold in with him like a folded map. At his side, the Secretary of State rubbed his fingertips as if coaxing blood into them. The Secretary of the Treasury had the handsome, weary look of a man who sees columns of figures in his sleep. A Marine followed far enough to close the door, and the doorknob touched wood with a click that sounded precise and final, like a thought being decided. "Good morning," I said, meaning nothing by it, and they nodded, meaning everything else. "Let's have coffee," the president said, and the request escaped his mouth on a cloud that turned to nothing before it reached the lamps. The pages we would discuss were already on the table, weighted by a cut-glass inkstand, letters from merchants in Charleston and Savannah, a draft proclamation to our customs collectors, a report from our consul in the islands, Saint-Domingue in 1 line, Saint-Domingue crossed out, and something else written in a careful foreign hand, Haiti. The accent peaked like a thorn. The president lifted the top sheet, frowned, set it down again. "We'll proceed without the French ambassador," he said. "He has nothing new to say. Nor would he say it to us if he did," the Secretary of State said dryly. He had a way of speaking that made a sentence seem like the logical next shape in a pattern, inevitable as winter. I dipped my quill, and the iron gall ink shined wet for a second, then went black. I wrote the date and the names. Outside, somewhere in the city, a wheel rattled. Thin ice shrieked under it like a frightened cat, and then was quiet again. Within the room there was the soft business of sitting and unfolding and taking up a sheet. The uneasy silence of men who know their minds are not quite equal to the size of the thing in front of them. "We need clarity," the president said. "We cannot have confusion in our ports. Already there are ships turning up with papers that pretend to be French and cargoes that are not. Already there is whispering among men who sweep our steps." He did not need to explain. The subject at hand had a way of approaching you even when you looked elsewhere. It came in letters written in a rush from Charleston, dockside whispers. A schooner out of Jacmel slipped in by night with sugar and coffee, a crew of men, brown and black, and one pale boy with a scar like a waterline under his ear. It came in the pews, where the minister had paused on the word deliverance longer than he might have. It came in the way the women in market huddled, shawls up, telling a story 3 ways at once, and each of them truer for being a little contradictory. "Sir," said the Treasury Secretary, and the lamplight picked silver out of the hairs at his temple. "The revenue laws, as they stand, will permit seizure of any vessel trading with them, if we define them with sufficient care. It is the definition that will be argued. Some captains will swear they dealt only with Frenchmen properly appointed. Others will say they bought from no government at all, only from whoever happened to stand at the end of the wharf with a scale. Words will do the work," the Secretary of State said. "We must be precise. What is it then to recognize? To name is to grant shape." He tapped the paper where the accent sat. "Haiti." I saw his finger hesitate there, the way one pauses at the edge of a pond in January, measuring the surface, asking if it will bear. It pleased me stupidly to think I could see their caution. There is a childish arrogance in noticing the vulnerabilities of powerful men. Then the door whispered open behind me, and relief came in the body of a servant carrying coffee. Anna's name was not spoken often in that room, and I did not know it for months, though I saw her almost every morning. She was small in the way a blade is small, a condensation of use and angle. She poured without looking at the cups, as if her eyes were employed elsewhere. The steam turned to a ghost and vanished. When she was near, I smelled starch and soap and the faintest sweetness of the kitchen's molasses, something that tugged at memory without offering a picture. She wore a thin kerchief at her throat. If she listened deliberately, she hid it perfectly, which is to say, not perfectly at all. A single pause between one cup and the next. The way a hand hovers above a handle for the length of a word. These are kinds of listening. "Thank you," said the president. Then, almost kindly, "Don't hurry. It's miserable out." "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice had no accent to it that I could place. It was not the round mouth of Virginia, nor the hard scrape of New England, but something clean and careful, learned one word at a time. She left then, and the door let in one small, sharp bite of the hall's cold and closed against it. "We will be asked," the president said, "why a people who have proclaimed themselves free should be punished." "Not punished," said the Secretary of State, and he held up a hand. "Protected against. We keep the peace by preventing contagion." He did not look at me, but the word sat on my page and blackened there. Contagion. I wrote it as they wrote it, in a manner that allowed a man to look pious saying it. The idea was simple as a winter fire. They had won their freedom with fire and blood against an empire, and from our shore that looked like a spark with no care for what it might land upon. The plan was to smother the spark with salt water and paperwork. When the meeting ended, my fingers had gone stiff from writing. I warmed them at the grate until the heat pricked and ached. On the table, the draft proclamation lay like a sleeping dog. "You'll transcribe that, Fair," the Secretary of the Treasury told me, and I nodded. "We must have it to the collectors before the next tide. A vessel is due at Baltimore from the south. We cannot permit uncertainty." I took the leaves and my inkwell and stepped into the corridor, where the stones held the night and the air felt like an admonition. A figure waited there on a bench, hat in his hands. He wore a coat too thin for the weather and boots that had a sailor's precise misery about them, too much brine for leather's comfort. Something in his posture, a polite stillness pushed against by fatigue, made me think of men who hold themselves like courtiers until the door shuts and they become their older selves again. The ones with torn cuffs and strange coins. His hair was cut short, not in the manner of the French, but like an islander trimming cordage. Practical even. "You are here for an audience," he said. He pronounced the N soft. "They will not see me today. The gentleman said perhaps another time." "Who is the gentleman?" I asked with a humor I regretted immediately. "The one who does not say his name," he said with a cramped smile. "That is how you do things, yes? The doors speak only to the doors." There was a politeness in his voice that made it sharper, not softer. He was not angry exactly, but he was tired of pressing his hat into obedience, while men he could not see pressed papers into other men's hands. "I am a clerk," I said, as if that could absolve me. "I can carry a card, if you have one." He laughed without joy and patted his pockets as if a card might appear by good manners. "I have a letter," he said. "Not a card. From General. From our leader." He changed the English word mid-flight, landing on a safer one. He took from inside his coat a folded sheet, the paper grooved with travel. The seal had been broken and restored more than once. Wax sat there like a wound that refused to knit. "It is in French," he said, "and in your English also. We wrote it twice so it would not be mistaken." "I'll take it," I said, because that was a thing I could do. His fingers were cooled by the hallway. They released the letter with reluctance, like a man giving up a story he had told himself to help the telling. "You have a name?" he asked as I tucked the paper carefully between my ledger leaves. He saw the motion, liked it. "A clerk's reverence for paper earns a man a little trust." "Samuel," I said. "Samuel Worth. Jean-Baptiste Charon," he said, And then, soft, Jean-Baptiste is enough. He watched me like a low tide. I came with a schooner to Baltimore, empty of cargo, full of hope. They would not break quarantine for hope. I walked the road in the frost to give this to your doors. When I am back, I will have to tell my countrymen what your doors said. The letter felt warm through the ledger, as if it had kept body heat from his chest. For what it's worth, I said, I will place it into the right hands. It will be read. The men in there, you know their names, they will read it. He looked at the closed door the way a man looks at weather. Men here do not like to say the word, he said. I watched their mouths when I was in Philadelphia last year. The ones who said it tasted something bitter and spit. The ones who would not say it tasted the thing anyway. What word? He glanced up the corridor toward the stairwell where servants' shoes whispered, then back to me. He had a dimple in his left cheek that showed when he was genuinely amused. It was quiet now. Haiti, he said softly. The accent had a sweet bite to it like a citrus note in a dark sauce. The name turns in your mouths. It is like the little hooks on burrs. It clings. When he left, he did it with a sailor's economy, no extra steps. His boots clicked once on the stone and were swallowed by the house. I opened his letter at the edge of a window where a bit of daylight had bullied the frost into transparency. The French would have read more elegantly, I thought, but the English was clear. Recognition, friendship, mutual commerce. No threat in it, only a steady insistence like a tide tapping the shore, what is owed to a free people who have paid with their blood's most expensive coin. The signature had been pressed hard enough to bruise the page. The name beneath it made my breath sit in my mouth for a second. Some names are like the shapes of storms on maps. They mean weather even when the sky above you is blue. I folded it again, slowly, as if that could make different words appear, and carried it back into the cabinet room with my head bowed. The way a man brings a message he cannot edit. They read it. I know because I watch their eyes move and their lips twitch once or twice without sound. The president traced the curve of the accent with his thumb. The Secretary of State said nothing for a long time, which is sometimes the only honest answer a man knows how to give. The Treasury Secretary cleared his throat and spoke the language he understood best: numbers, tonnage, rates of duty, distances, and days. Our neighbors to the south, he said finally, as if the geometry of it might make it less sharp. They are an example. An example is precisely what makes them dangerous, the Secretary of State said. He tapped the letter. A story has its own contagion. We are a nation built on one. Ask Lexington and Concord about that. I put the Haitian letter on the stack with the petitions from ship owners in exact alignment, as if I could make those edges harmonize. There are moments, small ones, when policies that take up whole pages turn on an ordinary detail, some humility of the body. The coal in the grate ebbed so slightly in that hour that the room cooled and men realized they were cold and pulled their coats tight. Someone coughed in the hallway and did not manage to swallow it in time. Wind moaned in the chimney with a tone like a voice passing down a hymn. The president looked at my fingers where they were stained black by iron gall, and I saw him think of ink and of stains and of what cannot be washed out easily. Without voting, without dramatics, we moved toward the shape of a decision the way water finds its route around a rock, because there is no other way it can go and still claim to be itself. The proclamation we sent to customs collectors and surveyors of revenue and the captains of revenue cutters had an admirable clarity to it. Our country is good at clarity. It said that vessels engaged in commerce with certain ports would be detained and their cargoes seized under existing law. It used phrases that made the hand not tremble when it wrote them. Public tranquility, safety of the states, prudence. It did not use the word Haiti. In the space where naming could have been, it unrolled language like a veil. The island lately called Saint-Domingue, certain insurrectionary societies, any persons styling themselves authorities not recognized by the civilized world. It was a way to say the thing without putting your mouth on its name, like drinking from a cup with a napkin between. When I brought the fair copy for the president's signature later that day, the winter light had slackened, and the sky over the Potomac had turned the color of pewter left in a damp cellar. I caught sight of Anna in the corridor outside the kitchen, her hands full of tin plates and her breath marking the air like chalk. She saw the folded paper in my hand and looked at it briefly as one looks at a knife someone else has wrapped in a cloth, considering both the blade and the care. "Cold today," I said. And even as I said it, I felt the stupidity of the words, their reluctance. "Cold," she agreed. Her voice did not tremble. "My little room has a draft that comes from nowhere. If I cover the window with a shawl, it comes under the floorboards. It is clever this winter." Then, without changing her tone at all, she asked, "Would a letter like that make a man free?" She didn't look at me when she asked, so it was safe for both of us. "No," I said. Honesty made my tongue heavy. "Not the letters we're writing today." "Then it will make someone else feel safe," she said. "And that is the same letter written twice." Because I was only a clerk, I could say, "I only copy the words men give me," which is what carpenters say about the shapes they are told to build. But a carpenter knows where a chair will bruise a back, and a clerk knows where a sentence will bruise a life. That winter, the city shrugged further into itself, and the river wore armor and complained about it in the night. The proclamation went out on paper and carried along ice and rain and a few days of clean weather. It reached men who wore wool and men who wore linen, men who wore no shirt at all under their coats because the weather at their end did not believe in such things. A revenue cutter looked handsome pulling into a small Carolina harbor at sunset. Men on the wharf paused with their hands on coils and watched and rearranged their faces into courtesy. Seizures began. Merchant letters multiplied and became complaints and then became predictions of ruin. In kitchens along the Atlantic, women poured coffee that came by legal routes and would now have to take longer ones. Children smacked their lips over molasses. Someone said, "Not so much. It is dearer now." And the child looked at the spoon with disappointment, which is the purest politics I know. I asked for leave to accompany a packet to Baltimore, an excuse to see how letters make themselves into laws at the edge of the water. They said yes because clerks can be invisible when they want to, and because Baltimore was a day's travel and no one believed that anything happened in a day that could not be undone by paper the next. The road there had been thawed and frozen so many times it had memory in it. The ruts were ruts from last winter pretending to be new. A wind moved across the marshes the way a rumor moves, quick and low and eager. It carried sea and rot, and a sweetness I would learn to recognize later as Cain burned wrong. At the harbor, the rigging sang a cold song. Men swore softly at knots that had gone mean with salt. A schooner lay off the pier with her sails reefed, hull blotched like the flank of an old horse. The smell of her was tar and citrus and something that made my tongue curious. Coffee. The color of the men who leaned against the rail was the color of elbows at work. Like oiled walnut, like river mud after rain. Their faces were guarded, then not, then guarded again. The captain was an American from Connecticut by his vowels, from influence by his tact. He was already arguing with a man in a buttoned coat whose self-importance wore a too small hat. "Not my fault," the captain said when he saw me look like a person who might write, which is an expression men learn to wear to draw certain kinds of attention. "Your paper says what it says. These beans will spoil. Coffee is a thing that asks for mercy and does not get it." "Where from?" I asked. "Jack Mel," he said, and when I opened my mouth, he added, "No, we did not trade with anyone. We merely spoke with them and they put a cargo into our hold in gratitude for our kind words." He smiled without smiling. "You will put that in your ledger, won't you? That we only spoke? No commerce. Conversation only. You'll have to unload under the supervision of the collector," I said, as if I was a person with authority. He shrugged one shoulder. The man beside him, some deputy collector with cheeks like uncooked dough, made a show of examining papers. "We all like to be the floor men walk upon. Who are they?" I asked quietly, nodding to the crew. "Men," he said shortly. "Sailors. A few with English. One speaks French with a music to it. They sing, you know, when they close their eyes. Not the songs we know. It is unsettling to hear men sing like water moving over rocks in another country and know they carry a story with them that would set fire to your curtains if you let it in the house." One of the sailors on the schooners deck looked at me and lifted 2 fingers in greeting. A scar made a pale rope down the side of his face. It looked like the path of a teardrop that had become impatient and cut a quicker road. He said something I did not catch and then clarified. We will be hungry if we wait. We will eat the coffee. He laughed once quick and did not look away. It was not insolence. It was what courage looks like when there is no point using it to fight. That night in the tavern near the docks, the air was thick with vinegar and fish. Men rubbed their hands over small fires as if coaxing dice throws from the flames. I held back as clerks do and listened. There was talk of French frigates off the capes, of insurance rates that climbed like ivy, of a rumor that the British would do business in the islands if we would not, because Britain will sell you the rope while selling rope to your executioner. A hymn drifted in from outside, someone singing as if prayer were a tool you could use to lever the day off your back. I went out to see who prayed, because sometimes it helps to know the name of the person whose story is in the air. It was him, Jean-Baptiste, his coat buttoned up to the last throat hole, a hat pulled low, singing in a voice that made even men who didn't believe in God glance toward the sky to see if maybe he was standing on the roof beam after all. I thought you went home, I said. He did not stop his hymn, but he eased it down to a human amount. Home is a boat as much as land, he said, and your paper is a weather. I cannot sail until it settles. I gave the letter, I told him. I know, he said, and for a second he softened. A gentleman, your Mr. State. He wrote a separate note and gave it to me like a man giving a comfort to a horse. It said, "We have received your communication with gratitude. Gratitude is a pretty shawl. It does not make a winter less clever." He held himself with a civilian's dignity, not the soldier's straightness. The knowledge that his own spine was the only authority he could count on. There is a woman who brings the coffee, he said then, surprising me. In the morning. In that White House. She walks without looking down as if she knows the floor listens. I saw her when the door opened. I thought, if we had a word between us that the others could not understand, I would use it. Some words are like that, I said. They make rooms. Your men fear the room our word would make, he answered quietly, and resumed his song, softer now, like a man warming his hands on it. When I came back to the president's house, the rooms were warmer and the ash in the grates was a landscape of soft cliffs. I found Anna rinsing spoons in a tin pan with water that steamed and made shapes in the cold. The sink was just a sliced half-barrel perched on a frame, and the water made a noise that sounded like a small beast breathing. When she tipped a spoon, the light slid off it and landed on the stone. You said earlier, I began, and she looked up without fear, which is a thing I had not expected to respect so much. A letter written twice, yes, she said. One to keep the winter out, one to keep something else from getting in, and if the something else is freedom, I asked. And if the word seemed melodramatic in my mouth, it did not in hers. That is always a draft, she said. If you can feel it, it is there, even if the men upstairs do not agree. You put a shawl over it. It will find a crack. It is cleverer than you. She dried her hands on her apron and went past me with a stack of plates. I stood in the corridor and felt the house breathing around me, as if the walls knew what our papers were for and braced themselves to be used. In the spring, new language came with the warm wind. The French had made their own proclamations. I read them when they arrived and translated them, then translated them again into men's appetites so they would be sure to understand. The British said what the British always say with their odd clarity: we will act in accordance with our interests, which is a luxury that would have looked honest on us if we had put it on. Merchants brought me petitions grimed with harbor dirt, a residue of tar and hope like thin glue at the edges. A captain from Providence told me with a hint of pride that he had managed to bring in a cargo by way of Curaçao, his face lit with the joy of tricks. I wrote, by way of Curaçao, and the Secretary of the Treasury said, no, and we wrote it again as under suspicious guise, and all the moral work, such as it was performed in those two words. It wears a man down to keep a name out of his mouth. I felt it in the ache at the hinge of my jaw at the end of the day. I saw it in how the President's teeth found his lower lip when he was thoughtful, in how the Secretary of State's hand hovered over the map and did not quite touch the island, as if his body feared to leave a fingerprint there. The map was a beautiful thing. Oceans like brushed silk, coastlines precise, the island in question a buckled fish with its mouth open to the east. A blankness hovered around its printed letters, a kind of caution wash, as if ink itself was not entirely sure it wanted to be there. In August, the air went heavy and sour. A fever laid men down on cots in the rooms off the kitchen. The doctor bled 2 of them and left with his bag, looking thinner than when he had come. Anna did not take to her bed. She tended men who sweated through their mattresses and turned their faces toward a breeze that would not arrive. Once I brought down a bucket of well water myself because there was no one free to carry it. She looked at me as if to say, everything is a kind of carrying. When the fever pulled back a little like a tide having some modesty, she leaned against the door jamb, exhausted, and closed her eyes for the length of a breath. "Is there singing at your docks?" She asked after a moment. "There is," I said. "Songs I don't know." "That is good," she said. "If a man sings a song that does not belong to you, it is a way of telling you he does not either. It reminds you not to put him in your pocket." When the harvest came not of wheat, but of petitions and of seizures, and of ships changing flags like shirts, I visited Baltimore again. I stood under the same tavern sign with its worn paint of a stag and watched a woman buying coffee that had been dared into the harbor by cunning. She poured it into a burlap sack from a bin, and the smell rose aching and deep, almost a voice saying, "Remember." Men argued about whether a nation that had taken liberty for itself in the teeth of empire could deny it by silence to another that had done the same. Men who, if asked about their own freedom, would gesture at the bruises their wrists did not bear. There were answers, of course. There are always answers. At the harbor, a boy from the schooner I had seen in winter stood with a coil of line around his shoulder, bird-boned and wary. He had the jumpy look of someone not used to the way a city moves. "Where is Jean-Baptiste?" I asked him, having no right to ask but wanting to know. "Home," the boy said. His English was new. He wore it like a shirt not yet broken in. "He go, then come, then go. He say when you see the big house again, you tell the woman who bring coffee that he sing the song. She know which one." The boy's seriousness made me smile helplessly. He frowned, then smiled with relief when he understood he had done it right. I carried that message in my mouth like a coin for weeks, never quite brave enough to spend it. Then one gray morning in the cabinet room, the voices of the men around the table seemed far away, and I could see only Anna's hands pouring coffee. And when she came near me, I said, too low for anyone else, "A man asked me to tell you he sings the song. He thought you would understand." Her hand paused in that way that is perfect only if you are looking for it. "I do," she said, and she did not smile exactly, but some small muscle near her mouth made an adjustment that meant light. She set the silver pot down with ordinary care. "I will keep listening," she said. Then she went on, pouring as if nothing had passed between us but heat and flavor. Years have a way of laying themselves down over you like papers on a desk. The older ones at the bottom begin to be unreadable except for the parts where the ink was pressed hard. I became better at writing the words men wanted, which is to say, worse at letting my own face show that I knew what they meant. The proclamation became a way of speaking we did not have to think about. We could write it again each time without looking up, and all the heavy furniture of its phrases would push the world into the shape we preferred. Children grew in the city who believed certain names were for the eyes only and not for the mouth. Once I went home to Rhode Island by coach to see my mother. In Providence, I ran into a student reading a broadside printed in French and then in English below. He sounded out the unfamiliar letters as if tasting spice, Ouverture, then stopped. And the man beside him said, "We do not say that name." The student looked scandalized, as if he had been offered a game of cards in a church. He folded the paper and blushed for his tongue. At the president's house, administrations changed. For a time, the new men liked to speak about commerce as a cure-all. They used the word experiment in ways that made me uneasy, as if a nation were a frog on a table. The map on the cabinet wall gained and lost colors like a patient through seasons of health and relapse. In that house, Anna grew older the way practical people do. the body subtracting, while the will remains a ledger that balances. She laughed sometimes in the kitchen, a small surprised laugh that seemed to have slipped in by mistake. She had a scar on her wrist I had never noticed in the early days. Perhaps because it had always been covered by sleeves, perhaps because some scars declare themselves only when you have earned the right to see them. On a summer evening when the house yawned open to the warm and moths made fools of themselves against the lamps, I found her sitting on a back step with a piece of bread and a cup of milk. The sky over the river was pink where it did not know how to be night yet. I sat nearby without presumption. I had learned by then to be quiet in the presence of things I did not own. "Your friend," she said without turning, which startled me because I had not thought she kept me in any category that would include a word like that. "The one who sings the song. Did he ever get what he came for?" "No," I said. "Not in paper. Perhaps in other ways." "That is often how it is," she said. "I once had a shirt that was too thin for winter. I put a second shirt over it and still the cold found me. Then I put a small stone in my pocket, and somehow that helped. It is not sensible, but it is often how it is." We sat there with the moths and the milk. The kitchen door breathed warm on our backs. The breeze carried a taste of the river, the dirty magic of it. Somewhere a violin scratched out a dance tune that was all bow and no skill, and yet I found myself tapping my foot as if the sound could not help but organize the air. "Do you know what I would like?" she asked, as if simply making a list. "Apples, pepper, thread." To hear a man say a name in a room where men say names all day long and pretend this one is mud. "Not for pity," she added, making a face. "For the sound. For the truth that it has weight." I looked at the map. The island was still there. A shape ink had not been able to bully the ocean into giving up. I thought of how a sentence begins, of how you have to choose a subject and then have the courage to let your verb find it. "I can say it," I said, though I knew that was not what she'd asked for. "You can," she said, almost kind. "But you do not make rooms. Not these rooms." A few years later, I read about a distant treaty in which France, reluctant parent, had demanded payment from the child it had beaten for decades. Reparations, they called it, with that European neatness that smells faintly of decay underneath the perfume. Our merchants rejoiced in the way men rejoice when a path reopens, even if it is lined with stones someone else must carry. No one in the cabinet room called it a ransom aloud. And still the coffee came and the sugar and the words, and we handled all of it with the decent gloves of commerce. You can hide almost anything if you keep your receipts. I kept the Haitian letter in the bottom of my desk. Under a false floor I had cut myself on a Sunday when the house was nearly empty, and my hands had wanted a task that was not writing. Sometimes I read it when the moon was up and the city felt like a door held ajar by a shoulder. The English in it still strained in places but did not break. The French lines had a confidence to them that felt like an arm around your back when you did not know if you could stand. There was a sentence near the end that I had not noticed enough when I first read it. It said something like, "We have done what we had to do to be men. We invite you to be the men you say you are. It is not that we were cowards. We were the kind of brave that wears a good coat to a funeral and speaks softly to the widow and leaves before the dirt is thrown. The kind of brave that builds fires and keeps the doors shut and calls it weather. The kind that chooses safety and writes it down in a clean hand so that it looks like a virtue." On the last day I saw Anna in that house. The light was strange, green and heavy, a storm's first word. She was not carrying anything. I had grown so used to her hands being occupied that it took me a moment to understand the miracle of their emptiness. "There is a draft," she said, half smiling, and lifted her chin toward the far end of the corridor, where the door to the garden had been left ajar by a careless man. The breeze moved down the hall with an eagerness that felt nearly human, stirred the papers on a console table, fiddled with a curtain, found us, and touched our faces lightly as if to say, "Do you remember me?" "I do," I said. "Look," she said then and nodded toward the cabinet room. The door had been left open there too, just enough to see the map. The island's outline was darker in that light, as if the sky had dipped its brush and gone back over it. "Say it," she said. For a second, the house seemed to hold its breath the way a forest does when the wind sets its mind to change. I said the name softly. because saying things softly in that place was the most dangerous way to say them. "Haiti," I said. No accent because my mouth had been trained by other masters, but the intent was there, and the room, our room, the one made by two people standing in a hallway with the door ajar, heard it. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. It was not triumph on her face. It was the satisfaction of a worker hearing a beam slide into the right notch. Later, when men younger than me sat at the long table and wrote with newer pens in a darker ink, a war far away altered what was polite to say. Recognition came on official paper at last, and there were speeches that congratulated themselves. By then, names had been learned and forgotten. The map had been redrawn so many times the paper was thin at the island, like a shirt patched and patched in the same spot. Some of the men who stood and nodded had been boys when the first letter came, running errands past me with the invincibility of youth. They had thought paper could outrun weather. None of us outlived the weather. I did not live to attend all the speeches, but I am told they used the right word finally. I picture the syllables leaving a clean mouth, landing on tile with a bright, honest sound. In the end, I think what we did was a thing men do when they are afraid of catching fire, even as they warm themselves. We built a polite distance around a truth and called that fence everything else. We were not monsters. We were winter in a good coat. We were the shawl on a draft. We were the clean edge of a blank space. If you want a lesson, make your ears into doors and listen to what the house is trying not to say. If you want a picture, imagine a map on a wall and a man in a warm room who knows the island's name and presses his finger where the ink is thin as if trying to push it in deeper, as if the paper might finally give and let the truth pass through. If you want a sound, it is this: a cup placed on a saucer, a letter folded quietly, a hymn sung in a harbor at night, and the hush that followed in the cabinet room whenever the wind found a crack and slipped past the men, reminding them gently, insistently, that history is a clever winter. The map kept its blank space where a name should have been. The last voice I heard vanish into static belonged to my sister. I was closing the Gulf Southern counter in New Orleans, linoleum sweating, doors chattering in the storm, when the crew line crackled and Maggie whispered, "No, it's me." She was in Galveston, pushed onto a last-minute hop. Flight 967 to Houston. 3 men in charcoal suits, she added softer. Government atomic something. One has a folder with a black sticker that swallows light. She tried to laugh, then didn't. The wind smells like batteries. Before I could talk her out of it, a man's voice near her shoulder and, click, at 3 a.m. I walked back into ops soaked through. Eddie Morales from weather, cuffs rolled, hair like a storm map, tore off teletype and smoothed it with his palm. 967 asked down to 6,500 in heavy rain, St. Elmo's fire. Then, we have company. Right after, a no call sign voice, turn south, do not acknowledge, static. Eddie said that wasn't tower, or any tower. I told him to help me find her. He didn't make me ask twice. By sunup, we talked our way onto a Civil Aeronautics Authority hop along the coast with an inspector named Walter Pike, a hat-sincere man who opened and closed a pocket knife when the news grew worse. Below us, the Gulf looked hammered, bands of water marching in different directions. We scanned for an oil slick, a raft, anything that would let grief turn into tasks. Nothing. At a marsh strip outside Freeport, a dark sedan with government plates waited but didn't wave. Hours later, further instructions amounted to a sheet we couldn't keep, telling us to say we had found nothing, in particular words. Rumors arrived faster than boats. A trawler had them in tow, a dry lake bed nobody charted, a hangar that belongs to men who don't put their names on things. The official statement said all passengers were Americans and search efforts were vigorous. The airline's man never said the flight number aloud. Families were being comforted. The radio set a violin underneath it all, as if that could make the sentences holy. We kept walking into rooms where men stopped talking. A dock wife said 3 strangers had made coffee in her kitchen and advised vinegar for the pot, then asked for names of anyone telling stories. A desk girl in Galveston remembered the men's hats, and one of them folding his glasses so carefully she held her breath. On an oyster road where maps didn't agree, a company man named Dobie told us to visit a private hangar at noon. Say you're here about the turbine. These fellas bite better after you scratch their ears. We went. The marsh smelled like pennies. A warden with a math shirt let us in because we knew a word he liked. Inside, the air cooled into a hush, and there it was. A Douglas with its wings eased off, windows and racks I knew by heart, upholstery with that scratch that kept you from sliding in summer. On the floor, scarlet, not any red. The one Maggie wore so Mum would feel seen from far away. The warden's smile trembled at the edges. Roll dynamics testing, borrow and return. Everyone helps everyone. When I asked about the people, he blinked as if I'd mispronounced a word. Debriefed, he said at last. In times like these, wrong hands are any hands turned by fear. We were escorted out while a man with a book made a line of us. In the car, Walter said if he swore to what he'd seen, he'd be punished, and that punishment would be used to prove he lied. If he stayed quiet, he'd keep his job and lose something truer. Eddie said the passengers were moved, interviewed on a shipper base that doesn't have a daylight name. They'll say no bodies were found, so no one can argue about a burial, he murmured. Voice pitched low to miss the air. That night a box arrived, Maggie's compact. Her employee booklet, a pay stub, stockings wrapped in wax paper. A note to herself, remember to put salt in the coffee, no burns. No smoke, no scarf. A phone number on the letter led to horns and a woman laughing, then nothing. After that, I stopped calling numbers that rang without ringing. The Tide coughed up a lonely life jacket a week later. A fisherman who found it got a check with no bank's logo, and his wife got a washing machine raffle prize. On the radio, he denounced rumor as communist. In Houston, a lab wife told me her husband had sleep-talked about isotopes with pet names. Before his trip, he took a call in the yard and returned with a leaf on his shoulder and a new worry in his eyes. It isn't unpatriotic to keep your kitchen as your kitchen, she said, hands twisting in her sash. Walter was transferred inland. He mailed a postcard of a snow-stunned dog and wrote that thin air leaves a man feeling like a map with the low parts cut out. Eddie and I made a ritual of the unsolvable. Tuesdays after my shift, under a flickering tube, comparing notes, collecting fragments. We set a locker at the bus station with clippings, a napkin ringed in coffee that looked like radar thumbprint, a stray pin. Later, a hand-sized strip of metal with a scrubbed paint number that read 967 if you wanted it to. Some afternoons we drove to the edge of the water with a thermos and said names quietly, like returning them to the Gulf so it would send something back. Life pressed in. People must live, even while carrying a sealed room in the chest. Eddie and I married at the courthouse. The clerk wore a kerchief because she was painting her bathroom later. We left the radio on at night. Weather, ball scores, liniment. Voices braided into a floatable river. Our daughter found a scarlet scarf tucked where I hadn't put it. I'd left it in a locker in a neighborhood bulldozed to make a road. "Can I wear it?" she asked. "Not today," I said. "It's for when we have to be seen from far away." I didn't ask how it had come back. I heard the men in my head teaching me how to sentence the truth without a subject. On year 10, a confident chin on the radio called 967, an unresolved mystery among mountains and jungles and foreign interference. He said some mysteries remain because we want them to, and some because someone else does. He didn't say a single name I kept in my locker. I shut the set off and listened to the room breathe. There's a sound a city makes when it's trying to be kind. Everything it isn't saying gathered into a hush. If you ask me the polite version, I'll tell it. A flight deviated in weather. Instruments failed. Responsible men did their duty. A wary country took protective measures. The living lived. If you ask like someone who's sat with an answer, I'll say this. A plane left a city with men carrying something that hummed even asleep. A nameless voice spoke. Other men folded the story into a windowless room. Some people came back with new sentences. Some did not. The rest of us learned the difference between a secret and a silence. The truest version might not be about men at all. It might be about the Gulf. On some nights I go where the wind tastes of rust, fish scale, diesel, and forever. The rigs make low constellations. The waves lay their palms down and pull them back, again and again, as if practicing a word that means keep and let go in the same breath. St. Elmo's blue hand scribbles for a moment on a broken pier. When the weather is right, the air smells like batteries, and the little radio in my pocket picks up a voice. "We have company." Something in me answers, "No audience required." Then the storm walks on. The static returns to tractors and soap. The tide smooths the shore like a hand smoothing a bedspread before company. I go home with salt and ozone in my hair and set Maggie's compact in its place. In the dark, the mirror keeps a little of my face, as if it had heard and wanted to remember. And out past the levees, patient and unsentimental, the Gulf keeps breathing out and in, working at a word it will not say.